Please listen to me just this once, Annie said, her voice catching as she looked at Richard Whitmore. I spent 3 years on this idea. Richard had already turned toward the kitchen door, one hand near the phone in his suit pocket. A meeting was waiting for him upstairs. His car was already waiting near the private entrance. He had come down to the kitchen only to inspect the dessert that had unexpectedly lifted sales at Whitmore Reserve after months of decline. He had tasted the cake. He had been satisfied. He had prepared to give a cash bonus to the person he believed owned the recipe. That should have been the end of it, but Annie Carter was still standing a few steps away from him, clutching a small jar of amber-colored syrup against her chest, as if it were the last piece of proof she had left in the world. Richard slowly turned back. What did you just say? Annie swallowed hard. Her lips trembled before she could answer. I said, I spent 3 years on this idea, sir. Richard's eyebrows drew together slightly. 3 years on this idea? The entire kitchen seemed to hold its breath. A tray of tart shells sat on the prep table, only half filled. The mixer had been turned off, but it still gave a faint hum as the paddle slowed. The smell of warm butter, orange peel, lightly burned sugar, and coffee still hung in the air. A few assistant cooks stood frozen in place, no one daring to breathe too loudly. Annie nodded. She held the jar tighter against her chest, so tightly that her thin fingers turned pale. That cake is mine, she said. The recipe is mine too. Chef Victor Langley moved so quickly that Annie barely had time to finish speaking. He stepped forward from Richard's left, cut straight in front of her, and pushed her aside with his arm. The push was not loud enough to cause a scene, but it was enough to make Annie's shoulder hit the cold edge of the stainless steel counter. It was also enough to remind her that, in this kitchen, she was not the one who had the right to speak. Annie, stop, Victor said under his breath, his voice full of warning. Then he turned to Richard with a polite smile, touched with false apology. Mr. Whitmore, I am very sorry you had to hear this. She is talking nonsense. Annie stepped back half a pace. Her shoulder still ached from the steel edge of the prep table, but she did not let go of the jar. She held it close to her body, as if the moment she released it, her 3 years of work would fall to the floor with it. Victor let out a small laugh. She has been here less than 3 weeks. Honestly, she is still learning the difference between the baking temperature for a tart and a soufflé. I let her help with a few simple tasks, and now she has convinced herself that she created the signature dessert for the entire chain. Richard looked from Victor to Annie. What is going on here? He asked. His voice was still calm, but the patience in it was wearing thin. I thought this recipe was yours, Chef Langley. Why is this girl saying it belongs to her? Annie opened her mouth immediately. Sir, I can explain. I made the first batch before. Victor cut her off before she could finish. What she means is that she assisted, he said quickly. That is all. She helped peel some oranges, washed pans, maybe measured sugar once or twice. You know how young people are these days, Mr. Whitmore. They touch one small part of the process and suddenly believe the entire result belongs to them. Annie looked at Richard, desperate to win even 1 second of his real attention. That is not true, she said, but her voice was too weak. In the vast kitchen, against Victor's smooth, confident tone, her words sounded pitifully small. Victor continued, his voice growing softer and more flattering. Sir, you built one of the most respected restaurant groups in the country. You understand standards better than anyone. A dessert like this does not simply appear from a notebook in someone's kitchen drawer. It takes training, experience, refinement, and a sense of the market. It takes years in professional kitchens. Annie flinched, because that was exactly what she had given it. Years, not in a prestigious academy, not under the lights of awards or polished titles, but years in a cramped apartment in South Atlanta, standing beside an old oven that ran unevenly after midnight, writing notes in her mother's oil-stained notebook, saving every tip to buy oranges, butter, and honey. She had burned batch after batch, cried over wasted ingredients, then wiped her face, scraped the scorched bits off the tray, and tried again. No one had patted her on the shoulder. No one had called her a chef. There had only been the smell of burned butter, small burns on her hands, and a fragile belief that if she worked long enough, one day someone would recognize the cake. She tried again. Mr. Whitmore, please. I didn't just touch the ingredients. I made the syrup myself. I tested every batch. I wrote down every change in my mother's notebook. I can tell you every step. Victor turned toward her. For 1 second, The smile vanished from his face. Enough. Then he turned back to Richard, his polished manner returning like a mask pulled back into place. She is nervous, Victor said. She wants attention. I don't entirely blame her. A kitchen like this can feel overwhelming to someone who is not used to it. But 3 years? He sighed. She has been here less than 3 weeks. How could she spend 3 years creating a dessert for a restaurant she had never even worked in? Richard glanced at Annie, then at the watch on his wrist. His expression hardened with impatience. Chef Langley, he said, I do not have time for internal kitchen disputes. Victor immediately straightened, as if those words had handed all the advantage back to him. Richard tightened his grip on the phone in his hand and added, Manage your staff. Victor seized the opportunity so quickly that Annie felt as if a door had just slammed shut in front of her. Yes, sir. Of course, sir, he said, his tone almost bowing. I will handle it immediately. I will send her off shift today and make sure this unprofessional behavior does not happen again. Annie's face went pale. Richard turned toward the door. Something broke inside her chest. Sir, please don't go, Annie blurted out. Richard paused, but only slightly. Victor swung one hand toward her without even looking. Be quiet. Then he turned back to Richard with a hurried smile. Mr. Whitmore, please go about your business. I am terribly sorry this disturbed you. I will handle everything here myself. I promise. Annie shook her head. Tears spilled before she could stop them, but she still held the jar tightly and stepped forward. Please, she said, her voice breaking. Please stop. Just listen to me once. Just once. Don't leave before I finish speaking. Victor clenched his jaw. Annie, he warned, but Annie was no longer looking at him. She was looking only at Richard Whitmore, the man who could take away her future without even knowing he had done it. I know I am only an intern, she said, each word trembling but clear. I know that in this kitchen, my voice is not worth much, but please, sir, just this once, hear me before you walk out of here. Richard's hand slipped away from the door handle. His face remained cold, and for a few seconds Annie could not tell whether he had been moved or was simply irritated by the delay. You have 3 minutes, he said. Victor immediately cut in, as if those words had lit a fire under him. Mr. Whitmore, you do not need to waste your time, Victor said quickly. She is just overly emotional. Young people are often like this when they are reminded of their place. Richard raised one hand, stopping Victor before he could wrap the insult in another layer of politeness. I am not that busy, chef, Richard said, and if this girl insists on saying something, let her speak. Annie blinked rapidly, trying to hold back her tears. Thank you, she said quickly. Thank you. I just need to explain. Don't thank me yet, Richard said. His voice was so even that she fell silent at once. I am giving you 3 minutes. If you cannot explain this clearly, you understand what happens next. Annie nodded, though her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Yes, sir, she whispered. She lifted the small jar with both hands, as if it were the only evidence left in the world that could prove she was not lying. This is why the cake tastes the way it does, she said. Without this, it is just flour, butter, and sugar. Victor gave a short laugh, but it sounded too forced to be comfortable. That is just a jar of syrup, he said. Every bakery has syrup. Annie shook her head. Not this kind, she said. Roasted orange peel, wild honey, thyme, vanilla, and sea salt. But the order is what matters. The orange peel has to cool a little before the honey goes in, or the citrus turns bitter. The thyme has to be taken out early, before it starts to taste medicinal. The sea salt goes in at the end, after the syrup thickens, or it disappears into the sweetness. Richard's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Victor immediately interrupted. Anyone can memorize a few professional-sounding lines. I didn't memorize them, Annie said, still looking at Richard. I ruined it 87 times before I got it right. The kitchen fell silent. Richard watched her for a long moment. He studied the way she held the jar. Not like someone inventing a story to save herself, but like someone holding the only thing left after her name had been stolen. He also saw Victor's hand tighten at his side. Richard turned to Victor. Can you make it? He asked. Victor blinked. Of course. Right now? Victor's smile stiffened. Mr. Whitmore, I don't think that is necessary. Richard looked back at Annie. Can you? Annie nodded once. Yes, sir. Victor stepped forward again. Frankly, I do not need to prove anything to an intern trying to cling to my job. Richard slipped his phone back into his jacket pocket. No, he said coldly. But you do have something to prove to me. Victor went rigid. Annie lowered her head, tears still clinging to her lashes. She had been given a chance, but that chance felt as heavy as a sentence. If she failed, she would not only lose her job, she would lose the right to believe that her 3 years had ever mattered. Richard removed his cufflinks and placed them on a clean tray nearby. Then he looked at Claire, his assistant. Record everything. Claire nodded and immediately opened her tablet. Richard looked from Victor to Annie. Same ingredients, he said. No pre-made dough. No assistance. Both of you will make the cake right here, right now. Before I leave this building, I will know whose recipe has been helping me sell. Victor's face darkened. Annie drew in a trembling breath. The fear was still there, cold in the palms of her hands. But this time, behind the fear, there was a tiny spark of hope. At last, someone had agreed to hear her. Claire Bennett stepped away from the prep table and turned on her tablet. Her movements were neat and precise, as if she was used to recording moments that might later become evidence. Victor turned toward the staff and clapped his hands once, sharply. All right, everyone, back to your stations. This is not a show. Richard's voice cut through his words immediately. No. They stay. Victor froze. Richard looked around the kitchen. His gaze passed over every chef, every assistant cook, and every person trying to look as if they had nothing to do with what was happening. If this recipe has been used in my system for the past 3 weeks, he said, and if there is any doubt about who truly created it, I want witnesses. A few cooks shifted on their feet. No one seemed willing to look Victor directly in the eye. Marcus Reed still stood beside the cooling rack, his arms folded low across his chest, his weathered face trying to remain calm. But Annie could still see the small trace of worry in his eyes. Marcus gave her a slight nod, so subtle that almost no one else would notice. But it was enough to keep Annie's knees from giving out. Claire cleared her throat. Mr. Whitmore? Should I record video or just take notes? Both, Richard said. And check last month's ingredient logs too. Victor's smile returned, but it was much thinner now. Sir, with all due respect, I don't think we need to make this any bigger than it already is. I can make the cake again right now and put an end to this. You will, Richard replied. So will she. Annie tightened her grip on the small jar in her hand. Her palms were damp with sweat. She wanted to wipe them on her apron, but she was afraid Victor would see the trembling and turn it into a joke. To him, every small weakness in her could become another reason to humiliate her in front of everyone. Richard glanced up at the large clock above the dry storage shelves. You said you needed 3 minutes to explain. You have used one. Tell me what you need. Annie blinked. To make the cake? To prove what you said. She looked down at the work table, then toward the pantry door, then at the line of cooks standing there, waiting to see whether she would fall apart. Her voice was very small at first. Cake flour, unsalted butter, buttermilk, eggs, sugar, baking powder, fine salt, fresh oranges, not bottled orange juice, wildflower honey, if we have it, pure vanilla, thyme, and powdered sugar for the top. Victor gave a quiet, contemptuous laugh. That is just a basic ingredient list. Anyone in this kitchen could recite that. Annie lowered her head for half a second. Her cheeks burned, but she forced herself to lift her face again. The list is simple, she said. The method is not. Richard's gaze shifted to Victor. Get her what she asked for. Victor pressed his mouth into a thin line. I will assign someone to assist at both stations. No assistance, Richard said. I made that clear the first time. The words struck Victor like a blow. He drew a deep breath through his nose, then went into the pantry himself. Annie heard containers being moved more forcefully than necessary, stainless steel bowls clattering together, and a bag of flour landing hard on the counter. A carton of eggs followed, then butter, oranges, honey, and the rest of the ingredients. Annie placed her small jar near the edge of the table, close enough that she could still see it. She looked toward the oven, then toward the sink, then to the empty burner where she needed to warm the honey mixture. For a moment, everything felt too big for her. The kitchen was too bright. The stainless steel tables were too cold. The eyes around her felt too heavy. Victor noticed her hesitation immediately. Already having trouble? No, Annie said. Her voice was quiet, but she began to move. That alone saved her. As soon as her hands started working, some of the panic in her chest eased. She weighed the flour and sugar carefully, not trusting measuring spoons. She cut the butter into small cubes so it would soften evenly. She rolled the oranges across the table to wake the oils in the peel. At the opposite station, Victor worked quickly, almost perfectly. He cracked eggs with one hand. He lifted bowls without looking. Every movement was polished and deliberate, as if he wanted Richard to see each gesture. Claire stood in a corner where both stations remained in frame. For the record, she said, Chef Langley, you are recreating the dessert currently listed on the menu as Langley's signature honey velvet cake, correct? Victor did not look up. Correct. Claire turned to Annie. Annie Carter, do you claim this is your original recipe? Annie's fingers stopped on an orange. For a moment, her throat tightened. Until now, no one in this kitchen had ever asked her that question seriously. Yes, ma'am, Annie said. It is mine. Victor gave a soft laugh. Of course. Richard heard it. Chef. Victor's expression changed at once. I apologize, sir. Annie picked up the zester and began shaving thin strips of orange peel, carefully avoiding the white pith. She placed the zest in a small pan and set it over just enough heat to draw out the oils. The aroma rose slowly, sharp and fresh at first, then warmer. It mingled with the butter and sugar still lingering in the kitchen air. Richard's eyes moved toward the pan. Annie saw it and nearly lost her rhythm. He had noticed. It was only the smallest change on his face. But to Annie, it mattered so much that her heart ached. She had not imagined that scent. It was real. It was different. Victor reached for a bottle of orange extract. Richard asked, You are using extract? Victor answered smoothly. To ensure consistency, sir. Fine dining requires flavor that can be controlled. Annie kept her attention on her own pan. The orange peel was almost ready. 10 seconds too long and it would turn bitter. She lifted the pan from the heat, then stood still and waited. Victor poured sugar into his bowl and started the mixer at a fairly high speed. Annie remained still, one hand resting lightly on the pan handle. Victor glanced over. What now? Praying over it? A few cooks almost laughed, then quickly swallowed it back. Annie's cheeks flushed. Richard looked at her. Why are you waiting? Annie answered without lifting her head. If I add the honey right now, the orange peel will turn bitter. It has to cool until the scent softens. Victor shook his head. That is not a professional way to measure. No, Annie said, her voice small but steady. It is the right way. Even she was surprised she had managed to say it. Marcus lowered his face, trying to hide the faintest smile. Victor's mixer grew louder. He moved quickly, beating his batter with the confidence of a man used to winning before the contest had even begun. Annie waited until the moment felt right, then added the honey to the pan, followed by thyme and vanilla. She counted silently, not only by seconds, but by scent. When the thyme just began to rise above the sweetness, she removed it. The sea salt went in only after the syrup had thickened and slid from the spoon in a slow, glossy ribbon. Claire stepped closer to Annie's station. Do you have those timing marks written down anywhere? Annie hesitated. Not all of them, ma'am. Some things change depending on the orange. Victor seized the chance immediately. How convenient. Annie glanced quickly toward Richard, then said quietly but clearly, That does not mean I am making it up. It means fruit is not the same every day. Richard did not answer, but he did not tell her to stop either. The butter had softened just enough. Annie began creaming the butter with the sugar, keeping the mixer speed lower than Victor's. He looked over and smirked. At that speed, you'll be here all afternoon. If I beat too much air into the mixture, the texture won't hold the syrup, Annie said. Victor's smirk disappeared. Richard noticed that too. Annie added the eggs one at a time. Her hand shook as she dropped in the second egg, and a tiny piece of shell fell into the mixture. Victor saw it immediately. There, he said. That is exactly what I mean. She is not ready. Annie froze. Her face burned with shame. For 1 second, she thought she might cry right there. But she only took a clean spoon and carefully lifted the piece of shell out without breaking the texture beneath it. No one helped her. She did not ask anyone to. She continued, alternating the flour and buttermilk, then carefully adding a thin ribbon of syrup into the batter. The mixture changed under the spoon. It became lighter, softer, then slowly came together with a very thin sheen, not too glossy, just enough for her to know it was right. If Annie's courage touched your heart, please like this video. Comment where you are watching from because someone near you may be watching this story too. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional and inspiring stories. Victor poured his batter into the pan first. He slid the pan toward the oven with a smooth, confident motion. Annie followed a minute later. Less graceful, less polished, but careful. She tapped the pan once to settle the batter, then stopped before tapping it a second time. Too much tapping would flatten the cake. Richard looked from one pan to the other. How long? Victor answered first. 32 minutes. Annie said, check it at 28, maybe 30, depending on the oven. Victor gave a quiet laugh. The oven has been calibrated. Annie looked through the oven door. The left side runs hotter. This time, several cooks lifted their heads before they could stop themselves. Richard slowly turned to Claire. Is that true? Claire typed quickly on her tablet. Last month. Maintenance noted uneven heat in the left chamber. It still has not been serviced. Victor's jaw tightened. Annie lowered her head. Not because she felt victorious, but because the relief almost hurt. One small truth had come out of her mouth, and this time no one could immediately crush it. Richard stepped back from the oven. Then we check at 28 minutes. Victor said nothing. Annie stood there with her hands folded in front of her apron, watching the heat begin to spread behind the oven glass. The jar of syrup sat almost empty on the counter beside her. Without it in her hands, she suddenly felt strangely fragile. She felt small again in the middle of that enormous kitchen, surrounded by people who could decide her worth with a single sentence. And now, the only thing Annie could do was stand there, keep her tears from falling again, and wait for her cake to rise. The first 10 minutes passed with the kind of slowness that made every sound feel larger than it was. The ovens breathed heat into the pastry line. The tablet in Claire Bennett's hand gave a soft tap each time she entered a note. Somewhere near the sink, water dripped from a faucet no one had closed all the way. Annie stood with her hands folded against her apron, trying not to rub her fingers together, trying not to show how badly they trembled. Victor did not wait quietly. Men like him rarely did when quiet might give someone else room to think. He wiped his counter with a towel, though there was almost nothing on it, then looked toward Richard with a regretful smile. This is exactly why kitchens need structure, Mr. Whitmore. Creativity is one thing. Discipline is another. Without hierarchy, every prep hand with a suggestion starts believing she's a partner. Annie kept her eyes on the oven door. She could feel the words brush against her skin. Prep hand. Suggestion. Hierarchy. Each one was chosen carefully. Not sharp enough to be called cruel, but heavy enough to remind her she stood at the bottom. Richard did not answer right away. He watched the oven display, then asked, how many people worked on the dessert before it went on the menu? Victor folded the towel and set it down. My pastry team contributed, of course. Under my direction. Claire looked up from her tablet. Names? Victor's jaw moved once. I can provide them later. Provide them now, Richard said. The kitchen tightened again. Annie heard a spoon touch the edge of a bowl somewhere behind her, then stop. Victor's smile thinned. Mr. Whitmore, I'd rather not drag the entire staff into a misunderstanding. Richard turned slightly toward Claire. Add that to your notes. Claire did. Annie did not know whether that helped her or made Victor hate her more. Both could be true. Marcus Reed stepped from the cooling racks and crossed to the dry shelf, moving with the easy slowness of a man who had survived too many bad bosses to hurry for any of them. He picked up a clean towel and handed it to Annie without making it look like comfort. Hands, he said quietly. Annie looked down and realized she had pressed her palms together so hard that syrup from the jar lid had dried between her fingers. She took the towel. Thank you, Mr. Reed, she whispered. Breathe through your nose, Marcus said. You'll know before they do. Victor heard enough to turn. Marcus, unless you're assigned to this little performance, return to your station. Richard spoke before Marcus could. He stays too. Victor gave a short nod, but his eyes hardened. Annie wiped her hands and tried to breathe as Marcus had told her. At first, all she caught was the general scent of the kitchen, sugar and butter, hot metal, coffee from the service station, the faint acid of citrus peel in the trash bin. Then, under it, the cakes began to speak. Victor's cake rose first. It climbed fast, too fast, pushing at the center. Annie saw the top dome slightly. His oven temperature might have been right, but the batter had too much air and not enough body. Pretty for a moment, then dry near the edges. Hers rose slower. That worried her until the smell settled. Warm orange, butter, honey. The faint green line of time almost gone now. Just where it should be. Richard checked the clock. 20 minutes. Victor moved closer to his oven. Mine is developing well. Annie said nothing. Victor glanced at her. No comment? She held the towel with both hands. It's too early. For yours, perhaps. For both, Annie said, then wished she had not. Victor's head turned. Excuse me? Annie looked down. I only mean the smell changes near the end. You smell cake and call it science now? Richard asked. What changes? Annie did not expect the question. She looked at him, then at the ovens. At first, it smells like raw sugar and wet flour, then butter, then the citrus comes up. Near the end, if it's right, the honey gets warmer but not dark. If it smells like caramel before the crumb sets, the edges are already going dry. Claire's pen paused over her tablet. Richard's expression gave nothing away. Victor smiled. That is charming. Very homespun. Annie's face burned. She knew what he meant. He meant small, poor, not trained, not worth putting on the menu of a restaurant where guests spent more on wine than Annie spent on groceries in a week. She lowered her voice. It kept the cake from failing. Victor leaned in a little. No, Annie. My name kept the cake from failing. Guests bought it because they trusted my standard. Do you think they would have ordered a luxury dessert with your name on it? The question hit harder than she wanted it to. Not because it was true, but because part of the world behaved as if it were. Annie had seen guests glance past bussers and dishwashers as though hands that carried plates could not also create beauty. She had seen people praise authentic flavor, while never asking whose life taught it. Marcus took one step forward. Careful, chef. Victor turned on him. I am being careful. That is why I'm trying to keep this kitchen from embarrassing itself. Richard looked at Annie. Answer him. Annie lifted her eyes. Sir, would guests have ordered it with your name on it? Victor's mouth twitched, pleased. Annie felt every face in the kitchen turn toward her. She wanted to say yes with confidence, but the truth was more complicated. Her voice came out low. Maybe not at first. Victor spread one hand as if the matter were settled. Annie continued before he could speak. But they came back because of the taste, not because of the name. If the name was enough, sales wouldn't have been falling before the cake. Claire's eyes flicked to Richard. Marcus's mouth softened. Victor's face went still. Richard did not smile, but Annie saw the point land. He was a numbers man. That sentence had numbers beneath it. The clock reached 28 minutes. Annie moved before anyone told her to. She pulled on oven mitts, opened her oven door halfway, and leaned close enough to test the scent without letting too much heat escape. The top of her cake had set at the edges but still gave slightly at the center. 2 more minutes, she said. Victor opened his oven fully and took his cake out. Mine is ready. Annie smelled it at once. Beautiful surface. Wrong finish. The orange was high and sharp. The sugar too forward. Not ruined, but not hers. Not the cake that had made people order second slices. Victor set his pan on the cooling rack and looked satisfied. That is what professional timing looks like. Annie did not answer. Her own cake needed those 2 minutes. She watched the second hand on the clock, breathing through her nose, feeling foolish and exposed and still somehow certain. At 90 seconds, Victor walked behind her station. It was a casual movement, almost lazy. He reached for a towel near the oven, but his elbow brushed the side of her empty mixing bowl. The bowl tipped. A streak of remaining batter slid toward her notebook paper where she had written her quick measurements for this test. Annie turned just in time and caught the paper before the batter covered it. Please don't touch my station, she said. Victor lifted both hands. Careful. You're getting jumpy. Richard saw the paper in Annie's hand. What is that? Annie hesitated. My notes for today's batch. Victor spoke quickly. Improvised notes, apparently. She could be writing anything after the fact. Claire stepped closer. May I see them? Annie handed the paper over with reluctance. Her handwriting looked small and uneven, nothing like the printed formulas in the company binder. Claire read the notes, then compared them to what she had recorded earlier. These match what she requested before she started, she said, including the timing on the peel and the oven check. Richard nodded once. Keep them. Annie's oven timer reached 30 minutes. She opened the door, and this time the scent rose clean. Honey softened the citrus. The butter had deepened without turning heavy. She pressed the center lightly. It sprang back slow, not wet, not dry. She removed the pan with both hands and set it beside Victor's. The two cakes rested only a few feet apart. Victor's looked taller, Annie's looked quieter, but as they cooled, the difference in scent widened. Richard stepped closer. Victor reached for a knife. I'll cut mine first. Annie's heart jumped. It should rest. Victor gave her a look. A cake of this size can be tasted warm. Not if you want the syrup to settle. She has an excuse for everything, Victor said. Richard looked at Annie. How long? 10 minutes would be better. 5 if you're in a hurry. I'm always in a hurry, Richard said. You get 5. For the first time, there was no cruelty in the words. Only fact. 5 minutes. Annie could survive 5 minutes. Victor could not. He paced once, checked his phone, adjusted his cuffs, then leaned toward Richard. Sir, while we wait, you should know I've protected this kitchen from many distractions. People come in with stories, hard lives, big dreams. That doesn't make them ready. Annie's throat tightened again. Richard did not look away from the cakes. Hard lives don't disqualify people, chef. Victor's lips pressed together. Annie looked down quickly before anyone saw what those words did to her. The 5 minutes ended. Claire set 2 clean plates on the table. Marcus brought 2 forks without being asked. Richard took the knife himself. Victor's cake was cut first. The slice stood neatly, but the crumb looked a little dry near the outer edge. Annie's hands curled into her apron. Then Richard cut Annie's cake. The knife passed through with less resistance. The inside held together, soft and even, with a thin line of syrup shining near the lower crumb. Richard set both slices side by side. Nobody spoke now. He picked up the first fork and tasted Victor's cake. His face did not change. He swallowed, set the fork down, and reached for the second plate. Annie could not breathe. Richard tasted hers. His hand stopped halfway back to the plate. Victor saw it. Claire saw it. Marcus saw it. Annie saw it too, and for one fragile second, the fear inside her loosened its grip. Richard did not take a second bite right away. That frightened Annie more than if he had frowned. He held the fork for a moment, looking at the cut edge of her cake, then set it down with care. Victor's smile came back too quickly. As you can see, sir, hers is close because she has been around my station. She has watched the process. That does not make it her creation. Richard picked up the fork again and tasted Annie's cake a second time. Victor stopped smiling. Claire made a note on her tablet, then looked at Richard. Do you want a blind comparison with the production cake from this week? Richard nodded. Bring it. Victor's head turned toward her. That won't be necessary. We're already comparing the 2 fresh samples. Claire did not answer him. She walked to the reach-in cooler, pulled out a covered tray marked for dinner service, and brought back a slice of the cake that had been selling all week. It had been prepared earlier that morning, plated for the evening menu, and labeled under Victor's name. She placed it beside the 2 new slices. Richard took a clean fork. He tasted the service slice first. Then he tasted Annie's again. He did not speak. He went back once more, cutting a small piece from the lower crumb where the syrup had settled. Annie's hands were cold now. She wished he would say something. Anything. She had thought the hardest part would be speaking up. She had not known that waiting for powerful people to decide whether truth mattered could feel worse. Victor shifted beside the counter. Mr. Whitmore, flavor can vary slightly from batch to batch. That is normal. Richard finally looked at him. It does vary. Victor's shoulders eased. Richard pointed at Victor's slice. Yours varies too much. The words cut clean through the kitchen. Victor blinked. Sir? Richard touched the plate with the production slice. Then Annie's. These two have the same finish. Same citrus line. Same honey depth. Same salt at the end. Yours is sweet, but it is flat. A cook near the pastry fridge pressed his lips together, trying not to react. Marcus kept his eyes down, but Annie saw his fingers curl once around the towel in his hand. Victor recovered quickly. With respect, sir. She likely copied what she saw in the production batch. Annie's voice came out before fear could stop it. I made that production batch. Victor turned on her. No. You assisted with it. I came in at 5 to 10 this morning, Annie said. You came in after 7. I roasted the peel, mixed the syrup, and folded it into the batter before you arrived. Victor gave a cold laugh, and now she claims she runs the kitchen before sunrise. Claire looked up. We can verify arrival times. Richard turned to her. Do it. Victor's expression tightened again. This is getting out of hand. No, Richard said. It is finally getting specific. Claire moved quickly through the tablet, pulling up staff clock-ins. Annie Carter clocked in at 5:08 a.m. Chef Langley clocked in at 7:17 a.m. Victor's jaw worked once. She was assigned prep. Richard asked, who assigned her? Victor paused. I did. Why? For efficiency. To make your signature cake? To assist my process. Annie held the edge of her apron. Sir, he told me the cake needed to be ready before the lunch tasting because he had a vendor call. He said if I wanted to keep my place here, I should prove I could follow instructions. Victor pointed a finger toward her without touching her. Careful. The word carried enough threat that Annie went quiet at once. Richard noticed. Don't warn her. Answer me. Victor drew himself upright. Mr. Whitmore, I lead this department. Interns perform tasks. Recipes developed under my supervision are part of the department's work. Annie felt the old fear rise again. There it was. The neat sentence that could erase her. Under my supervision, department work. It sounded official. It sounded like something a company lawyer might accept if nobody cared to look deeper. Claire said, there are recipe submission records, Mr. Whitmore. I can check whether Chef Langley filed development notes for this cake. Victor's eyes moved to her tablet. I plan to submit them this week. Richard's mouth tightened. After sales went up, Victor did not answer fast enough. Annie looked at the 3 plates on the table. Her cake. Victor's cake. The production cake. The proof was sitting there in crumbs and scent. But proof did not speak unless someone let it. She had learned that early in life. Truth could be present and still be ignored. Richard turned to Annie. Tell me one thing in that cake he would not know unless he created it. Annie took a breath. The syrup is not brushed on top. Victor scoffed. That's obvious. It's in the batter. No, Annie said. Not just in the batter. Richard waited. Annie stepped closer to the plates, careful not to crowd him. The first portion goes into the batter. The second is folded into the buttermilk before the flour is finished. The last spoon goes into the glaze after it cools. That's why the flavor comes in 3 places. First, when you smell it. Then, when the crumb opens. Then, after you swallow. Claire glanced at the production slice. That matches what I tasted. Richard looked at Victor. Is that your method? Victor lifted his chin. I don't need to recite my methods on command. You accepted a bonus on command. The kitchen went still in a different way now. Not empty, not frozen, but alert. Even the cooks who had tried to look busy were listening. Victor's face colored. Mr. Whitmore, I have served this company for 9 years. And she has served it for 3 weeks, Richard said. Yet she has explained more about this cake in 10 minutes than you have since I came downstairs. Annie's eyes burned. She looked down quickly, afraid the tears would make her seem weaker. She wanted to be strong. She wanted to be the kind of person who could stand there dry-eyed and steady. But she was tired. Tired from the early mornings, the fear of losing her job, the way Victor had smiled with her work in his hands. Marcus stepped forward just enough to be seen. Mr. Whitmore. Richard looked at him. Yes? Marcus wiped his hands on his towel. I saw her test that syrup before it ever went on the menu. More than once. Victor snapped. Marcus. Marcus did not raise his voice. I'm talking now. That simple sentence carried years inside it. Richard turned fully toward Marcus. Go on. Marcus looked at Annie, then at Richard. She came in early when the rest of us were still getting coffee. Used leftover oranges at first, paid for honey herself one day because the house brand wasn't right. I told her not to leave her notes around. He paused, his mouth pressing into a hard line. Should have told her louder. Annie shook her head slightly. Mr. Reed, you don't have to. Yes, I do, Marcus said. Old men who stay quiet too long help build the walls that trap young people. The words settled over Annie in a way that almost made her knees weaken again. But this time, not from fear. Victor looked around, sensing the ground shifting. This is sentimental nonsense. We are discussing professional ownership, not kitchen gossip. Claire tapped her screen. I have camera footage from the prep area available for the last 30 days. It may take a few minutes to pull the correct mornings. Richard looked at her. Pull them. Victor stepped closer. Sir, before we turn this into a spectacle, may I speak to you privately? No. Mr. Whitmore. No. Richard repeated. You were comfortable accepting praise in front of your staff. You can answer questions in front of them. Annie watched Victor's face change. The charm thinned. The authority remained, but it no longer seemed effortless. He was measuring exits now. Not doors, but excuses. Richard turned back to Annie. Where are your original notes? In my locker, she said. In my mother's notebook. Victor laughed again, but this time it sounded rough. Convenient that she keeps claiming a notebook nobody has seen. Annie looked at Richard. I can get it. Victor moved first. No staff leaves during an active review. Richard's eyes cut to him. Claire, go with her. Claire nodded. Annie? Annie hesitated. Her locker held more than notes. It held the old notebook wrapped in a dish towel, a cheap bus pass, half a granola bar, and the last photograph she had of her mother tucked inside the back cover. She hated the thought of carrying that private piece of herself into Victor's reach. But she had asked to be heard. Now she had to bring every piece of truth she owned. Yes, ma'am, she said. As Annie stepped away from the station, Victor leaned near enough for only her to hear. You have no idea what you're doing, he murmured. Annie stopped for half a breath. Her hand tightened at her side, but she did not turn. From across the kitchen, Richard's voice came cold and clear. Chef Langley, step back. Victor did. Annie walked toward the employee corridor with Claire beside her. Behind them, the 3 slices of cake remained on the table, and for the first time since Victor had taken credit for her work, Annie felt that her recipe was no longer standing alone. Someone else had tasted the truth. The employee corridor felt colder than the kitchen. Annie walked beside Claire Bennett with her hands held close to her apron, as if any wrong movement might make the whole chance disappear. Behind them, she could still hear the low murmur of the pastry staff and the metal click of someone setting down a fork. Ahead, the lockers lined the wall in 2 rows, dented and gray, each one holding pieces of lives the restaurant never asked about. Claire slowed when they reached Annie's locker. Take your time. Annie almost laughed, but there was no strength in her for it. Time was the one thing she did not have. Richard Whitmore had given her 3 minutes, then a test, and now the entire kitchen was waiting to see if her truth could survive paper. Her fingers shook as she turned the little combination lock. She missed the second number and had to start again. Claire did not rush her. On the second try, the lock opened. Annie lifted the latch and pulled the door back. Her canvas bag sat on the lower shelf beside her street shoes and a folded sweater. She took the bag out carefully, as though the old notebook inside might bruise if handled too hard. It's in here, she said. Claire nodded. May I see it? Annie hesitated. The notebook was not a company file or a recipe binder. It was the last place where her mother's handwriting still lived. Its cover had softened at the corners. Some pages had stuck together years ago and never fully separated. There were grocery totals in the margins, notes about oven heat, small reminders like add more lemon next time and don't forget church potluck. Annie had brought it to the restaurant because leaving it at home felt unsafe. Now bringing it out felt just as unsafe. Claire's voice softened. I'll handle it carefully. Annie unwrapped the dish towel around it and handed it over with both hands. Claire opened the notebook. Her professional expression changed just a little. Not pity. Respect, maybe. She turned the pages slowly. The first recipes were written in older handwriting. Then came Annie's smaller notes, darker ink, more crowded, filled with dates, ratios, crossed out lines and corrections. Claire stopped near the back. Honey citrus velvet cake. Annie nodded, her throat tight. There are earlier versions before that. The first one was called orange honey cake. It wasn't good. Claire read silently. Version 12. Too bitter. Version 19. Crumb too heavy. Version 30. 1. Try buttermilk. Version 46. Roast peel. Lower. She looked up. You really tracked every attempt. Not everyone, Annie said. Some were too bad to write down. For the first time that morning, Claire gave a small, human smile. Bad attempts count too. Annie looked down. Not usually for people like me. Claire did not answer right away. She closed the notebook halfway, keeping one finger between the pages. Let's bring this back. As they turned, Annie stopped. Miss Bennett? Yes? If he gets angry, will you still show Mr. Whitmore? Claire understood who he meant. Yes. Annie nodded, but it did not make the walk back easier. When they returned to the kitchen, Victor was standing too close to Richard, speaking in a low voice that stopped the instant he saw the notebook in Claire's hands. Marcus remained near the cooling racks. Several cooks pretended to work, but their attention kept drifting back to the table where the 3 slices of cake sat like evidence. Richard looked at Claire. Well? Claire placed the notebook on the prep table, not near Victor, but in front of Richard. There are dated recipe notes going back 3 years. Multiple versions of the same cake. The current method matches what Annie described, including the syrup stages, buttermilk adjustment, and oven timing. Victor gave a dry laugh. A notebook proves she likes to write. It doesn't prove she created the cake served here. Annie's hands tightened. Claire turned a few pages. Some entries predate her employment here by years. That could be anything. Richard looked at him. Chef, I'd suggest you stop talking before the facts make you sound worse. Victor's lips pressed together. Richard turned a page himself. He did not rush. That surprised Annie. He looked at the older handwriting first, then at Annie's later notes, then at the small date beside the final recipe. His thumb paused near a faint stain of honey on the paper. What is this line? He asked. Annie leaned forward. Her voice came out low. That says, Mom would have liked this one. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Victor shifted. Sentiment does not establish ownership. Marcus muttered. No, but theft usually argues this hard. Victor snapped his head toward him. What did you say? Marcus met his look. You heard me. Richard closed the notebook but kept his hand on it. Claire, the footage. Claire tapped her tablet. I have the prep station clips from the last 3 weeks. I also pulled this morning's camera near the ovens. Victor's expression flickered. Annie saw it. So did Richard. Claire connected the tablet to the wall monitor used for service tickets and training videos. The screen lit up with kitchen footage from 2 weeks earlier. The angle showed Annie alone at the prep station before sunrise, setting strips of orange peel into a pan, measuring honey, writing in her notebook, then pouring syrup into a squeeze bottle. Timestamp. 5:22 M. The next clip showed Victor entering much later. He picked up the bottle, tasted from a spoon, then looked toward the hallway before taking Annie's notebook from the side of the station and flipping through it. Annie felt sick watching it. She remembered that morning. She had thought she misplaced the notebook under a towel. She had apologized to herself for being careless. Richard's face hardened. Victor spoke quickly. I review staff notes all the time. That is part of leadership. Claire played the next clip. It showed Annie preparing the batter alone. Victor arrived after the pans were filled. He said something to her, pointed toward the dish area, then signed off on the prep sheet after she left. Claire said, the production log lists Chef Langley as developer. The prep footage shows Annie making the product. Victor stepped forward. That is not unusual. A chef delegates execution. Richard did not look away from the screen. Play this morning. Claire did. The clip showed the challenge from another angle. Victor stood near Annie's oven while she reached for a towel. His hand moved to the temperature controls. It was quick, but clear. A few seconds later, Annie turned back, noticed the change in scent, and corrected the oven. A soft sound moved through the staff. Not loud, but enough. Annie stared at the screen. Until that moment, she had known he disliked her. She had known he wanted her quiet, Seeing him try to ruin the cake in front of everyone made the truth colder. It was not pride alone. He had been willing to destroy her proof, then call her incompetent for the damage he caused. Richard turned to Victor. "Explain that." Victor's mouth opened, then closed. "I adjusted the oven because she was using the wrong setting. You adjusted it without telling anyone. It was instinct." Annie spoke before she could stop herself. "You were trying to make it fail." Victor turned on her. "Don't flatter yourself." Richard's voice cut through the exchange. "Look at me, chef." Victor faced him. Richard picked up the envelope of cash from the table where it had been left beside the tasting plate. "When I handed this to you, did you know the recipe was hers?" Victor's face changed. Not guilt, calculation. "I knew she had contributed." "That isn't what I asked." Victor drew a breath. "I knew she had done some prep work." Richard stepped closer, still holding the envelope. "Did you create the cake?" Victor's silence lasted too long. Annie felt tears slide down her face, but she did not wipe them away. Not now. Not when the silence was finally telling the truth for her. Victor looked around the kitchen, as if searching for someone willing to save him. Nobody moved. Even those who feared him seemed unable to look at him the way they had before. At last he said, "The cake was developed under my department." Richard's jaw tightened. "That answer just cost you whatever respect I had left." Victor's voice sharpened. "Mr. Whitmore, you cannot be serious. You're going to take the word of a trial intern over a chef who built this pastry program?" Richard placed the envelope on the table between them. "No. I'm taking the word of the cake, the notebook, the footage, the logs, and every answer you avoided." Victor's face flushed. She would still be nothing without this kitchen. Annie flinched. Richard's eyes narrowed. And this kitchen would still be losing money without her cake. The words struck Annie so deeply she had to grip the edge of the table. For weeks, she had carried the truth alone, afraid it would sound too small in her mouth. Now Richard Whitmore had said it in front of everyone. Claire closed the video. Marcus looked toward Annie, and this time he did not hide his pride. Richard turned to Victor with the envelope still on the table. "We're not finished," he said. "But we are done pretending." Annie stood beside her mother's notebook, cheeks wet, hands shaking, and understood that the door had not opened all the way yet. But it was no longer locked. Richard left the envelope on the prep table where everyone could see it. It sat between the 3 slices of cake, no longer a reward but a question. Annie kept one hand on the edge of the table and the other near her mother's notebook. She did not touch the money. She did not trust herself to move. Victor looked at the envelope, then at Richard. "You're making a mistake." Richard's face did not change. "I've made one already. I'm correcting it." "With respect, sir, you're reacting to emotion." "No," Richard said. "I'm reacting to evidence." Victor gave a tight laugh. "Evidence? A notebook? A few video clips? You know how kitchens work. Ideas move. Staff contribute. A chef shapes the final product. That is how leadership functions." Annie felt the sentence wrap around her throat. It sounded polished enough to survive in a meeting. It made theft look like management. It made her hands vanish from her own work. Claire stepped closer to Richard. The footage shows Annie making the syrup and batter before Chef Langley arrived. The logs show the same pattern on multiple high sales days. The notebook predates her employment, and the live test confirms the flavor profile. Victor turned on Claire. "Your operations, not pastry." Claire did not blink. "I know how to read a timeline." A few cooks shifted behind the line. Annie heard the small movement of shoes against the tile, the tiny rearranging of people who were starting to understand that the man they feared might not be untouchable. Victor sensed it too. His voice lowered. "Mr. Whitmore, may I remind you that I have relationships with critics, investors, and several private dining clients. If you humiliate me in front of staff over a misunderstanding, this will not stay in this kitchen." Richard looked at him for a long second. "Was that a warning?" "It's reality." "No," Richard said. "Reality is that my pastry chef accepted a bonus for a cake he did not create. Tried to dismiss the person who did create it. Altered an oven during a verification test. And is now threatening me with gossip." Victor's face tightened. "I am trying to protect the brand." Annie looked at him then. She could not help it. Protect the brand. He had said it as if the brand were a living thing, and she were dirt on its sleeve. Richard followed the change in her face. Miss Carter. Annie straightened at once. Yes, sir? You said he told you to make the production batches before he came in. Is that correct? Yes, sir. How many times? Annie looked at Claire, then at Marcus, then back at Richard. Most mornings after the first week. He'd leave notes on my station or text the kitchen group. Sometimes he said the lunch prep needed to be ready early. Sometimes he said he had vendor meetings. I thought, she stopped. Richard waited. You thought what? I thought if I did well enough, he might let me put my name on it later. Victor scoffed. That is absurd. Annie's voice grew smaller, but she did not stop. I know it sounds foolish, but I needed the job. And I thought maybe that was how professional kitchens worked. You had to prove yourself quietly first. Marcus muttered. That's what people tell the young when they plan to keep taking. Victor snapped. Enough from you. Richard's eyes went to Victor. You don't give orders right now. The words landed harder than a shout. Victor's mouth closed. Claire tapped her tablet again. There may be messages. Annie, do you still have the texts? Annie nodded. On my phone. In my locker. Richard said, get it. Annie hesitated, afraid to leave her notebook behind. Claire noticed. I'll keep it here beside me. Annie went back to the corridor, this time alone but with Richard's instruction behind her. When she returned with her phone, her hands were shaking so much she nearly dropped it, unlocking the screen. She opened the kitchen group thread and scrolled. Claire read over her shoulder. Annie, prep citrus base before 7. Have batter scaled before chef arrives. Do not discuss test batches with floor staff. Leave notebook in pastry office for review. Claire paused. This is from Chef Langley's number. Victor lifted his chin. Those are routine directions. Richard asked. Why tell her not to discuss test batches? Victor's answer came too late. To prevent confusion before menu approval, Annie spoke softly. He also told me not to tell anyone I made the syrup because people would think I was bragging. Victor turned toward her. You misunderstood. I didn't, Annie said. Her own firmness startled her. She had spent weeks lowering her voice around him. Now, with her phone in her hand and her mother's notebook on the table, lowering it felt like betraying herself. Richard held out his hand. May I see? Annie gave him the phone. He read the messages without rushing. Every second he spent with the phone seemed to remove another board from the wall Victor had built around the truth. When Richard handed it back, his voice was quiet. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Annie looked at the floor. I was scared. Of him? She nodded. Of losing your job? Yes, sir. Richard waited. Annie forced the rest out. And of not being believed. No one dressed that sentence up. No one corrected it. It sat there plain and heavy. Victor broke the pause. Every employee is afraid when they're caught overstepping. Fear doesn't prove innocence. Marcus stepped forward. No, but patterns prove plenty. Richard turned to him. What pattern? Marcus looked around the kitchen before answering. This isn't the first time Chef Langley put his name on work he didn't start. Most folks let it go because they need rent more than recognition. A woman from the guard manger station, who had stayed near the doorway, spoke before fear changed her mind. He did it with the holiday tart last year. Victor whirled toward her. Dana, she swallowed. You changed the garnish and called it yours. Another cook, younger, still holding a piping bag, said. And the bourbon pecan mousse. Mateo built that base. Victor's voice rose. This is ridiculous. Richard raised his hand. Stop. The kitchen obeyed him in a way it had never obeyed Annie. Richard looked around. Anyone else with relevant information will send it to Miss Bennett before the end of the day. No retaliation, no schedule cuts, no quiet punishments. If any of that happens, it comes to me. Claire nodded. I'll set up a confidential channel. Annie stared at the people who had just spoken. They did not look brave in the way movies made bravery look. They looked nervous, pale, and tired. That made it matter more. They were afraid and had spoken anyway. Victor took one step back, then seemed to realize it and planted his feet. You're letting a kitchen mutiny form because one intern cried convincingly. Richard's eyes hardened. No, chef. I'm finding out what kind of kitchen I've been paying you to run. Victor opened his mouth, but Richard turned away from him and faced Annie. Miss Carter, Did you authorize Chef Langley to present this cake as his own? No, sir. Did he ever tell you your name would be attached to it? Annie shook her head. No, sir. Did he ever pay you, credit you, or submit your recipe under your name? No. Richard turned back to Victor. That is not leadership. That is taking. Victor's face flushed. You want the truth? Fine. She had a decent home-style formula. I made it marketable. Annie's breath caught. There it was. Not an apology, not even a denial. A confession dressed in contempt. Richard went very still. Say that again. Victor realized too late what he had done. I mean, I refined. No, Richard said. You said she had the formula. Victor's mouth tightened. Claire wrote it down. Marcus closed his eyes for a second, as if the truth had finally reached a place no one could push it back from. Annie stood with her phone against her apron, and tears still drying on her cheeks. She had imagined proof would feel like relief. Instead, it felt like exhaustion, like setting down a heavy box, only to realize how long she had been carrying it. Richard picked up the cash envelope from the table. He did not give it to Annie yet. He held it at his side and looked at Victor. You will remain here, he said. You will not speak to staff. You will not touch the logs, the cameras, or the recipe files. Claire will begin a formal review now. Victor's face went pale with anger. You're suspending me? I'm deciding whether suspension is too generous. The words rippled through the kitchen. Richard turned to Annie, and for the first time his voice lost some of its cold edge. Miss Carter, your recipe will not leave this room under anyone else's name again. Annie nodded because she could not speak. He continued, but before I make a final decision, I want the full record. Annie's heart dipped. The fear returned in a smaller, sharper form. Final decision, full record, more waiting. Marcus seemed to feel it. He came closer and stood just behind her, not touching her. Only near enough for her to know she was not alone. Claire closed the tablet cover. I'll pull payroll access, file history, recipe submissions, and camera archives. I'll also copy Annie's notebook pages with her permission. Richard looked at Annie. Do you consent? Annie looked at the notebook. Her mother's writing. Her own notes. The final recipe. The one thing she had protected as if paper could be family. Then she looked at Victor. Yes, sir, she said. Copy it. Victor's eyes burned into her, but Annie did not lower her head. Richard placed the envelope back on the table, no longer near Victor. Then let's finish this properly. Annie looked at the slices of cake, at the jar nearly empty beside them, at the notebook that had survived being dismissed as nothing. The truth had not won yet. Not fully, but it had stopped apologizing for being there. Claire did not waste time. She moved to the small office beside the pastry line, where the kitchen manager kept the printer, invoice folders, and a computer that seemed older than the restaurant's wine list. Richard followed her only as far as the office door, then stopped and looked back at the kitchen. No one leaves yet, he said. Service can be covered by the second team. This review happens now. Victor folded his arms. You're shutting down pastry over a misunderstanding? Richard looked at the 3 cake slices on the prep table. I'm shutting down the misunderstanding. Annie stood near Marcus with her notebook still in sight. Her body felt worn out, though the morning was not even over. She had dreamed of someone tasting her cake and smiling. She had not dreamed of standing in front of a billionaire, a furious chef, and half a kitchen while every private note she had ever written became evidence. Marcus leaned closer. You all right? Annie gave a small nod that did not convince either of them. You don't have to pretend with me, he said. I'm scared, she whispered. I know. What if they still find a way to twist it? Marcus looked toward Victor. People can twist words. Harder to twist timestamps. Across the kitchen, Victor watched them. His face had settled into something colder now. The charm was gone, but the pride remained. He looked like a man waiting for the room to remember who he had been before this morning. Claire came back with printed sheets and her tablet. Mr. Whitmore, I have the recipe file history. Richard took the first sheet. Read it. Claire stood at the end of the table. The official submission for Chef Langley's signature honey velvet cake was entered by Chef Langley last Friday at 9:43 p.m. It includes a description and plating notes, but no full development formula, Victor said, because the formula was still being standardized. Claire continued. There are no earlier test versions under his profile. No ingredient trials. No costing worksheet before the cake began selling. Richard looked at Victor. For a dessert you spent months developing? Victor's mouth tightened. Some chefs work by instinct. Annie almost looked up. The word stung because it was the word he had mocked in her. Instinct was professional when he claimed it. Childish when she did. Claire set down another sheet. Annie Carter has no access to the official recipe system. Her employee level does not allow submissions. Richard's face hardened, so even if she wanted to enter her recipe, she couldn't. No, Claire said. Not through the system. Annie felt that sentence pass through her. It explained something she had felt since her first day but had not known how to name. The door had never been built for her to open. Victor seized on it. Exactly. She had no authority to develop menu items. Richard turned to him. That is not the point you think it is. Victor's eyes narrowed. Claire placed Annie's notebook beside the printed records. Her handwritten notes show development over 3 years. The final version matches the production cake more closely than Chef Langley's live sample. Richard asked, "Can we compare ingredient quantities?" Yes, Claire pointed to the page. Annie's notebook lists roasted peel syrup in 3 stages. Chef Langley's official submission only says citrus honey glaze. No process, no ratios. Victor gave a bitter laugh. Because I do not write every thought into a file like a school assignment. Annie's voice came out before she planned it. But you wrote your name. Everyone turned to her. She looked down at her hands, embarrassed by her own boldness, but she did not take the words back. Richard looked at Victor. Answer her. Victor breathed through his nose. I put my name on a product I approved. You put your name on a product you could not reproduce, Claire said. Victor snapped. I reproduced a cake. Not that cake, Richard said. The words were plain, and because they were plain, they hurt Victor more. His face flushed. At the far side of the kitchen, Dana from Garde Manger shifted again. She had spoken once already, and Annie could tell she regretted, and did not regret it at the same time. Richard noticed her. You said there was a holiday tart last year. Dana pressed her lips together. Richard's voice lowered. No one is being punished for telling the truth today. Dana nodded, though fear still showed in her shoulders. Mateo made the cranberry pear filling. Chef Langley changed the crust and submitted it as his seasonal tart. Victor let out a harsh breath. That filling was unusable until I corrected it. A young cook near the mixer said, Mateo corrected it. You told him to go home early before the tasting. Victor turned. You want to join this too? The cook swallowed. No, chef. Richard stepped between their lines of sight. His name? The cook looked at Richard. Evan, sir. Evan, Richard said. You don't answer to Chef Langley right now. Say what you know. Evan set the piping bag down. Mateo had notes. He kept them in his locker. After the tart went on the menu, his hours got cut. He left 2 months later. Claire typed quickly. I'll pull payroll and schedule changes. Victor laughed again, but there was less strength in it. So now every old complaint becomes fact? Marcus spoke. No, but when enough people point to the same smoke, a smart man checks for fire. Richard looked at Marcus. Did you ever report any of this? Marcus's face changed. Not shame exactly, but something close. Once. Years ago. Different manager. Nothing came of it. Why not report again? Marcus glanced at Annie. Because bills don't wait for justice, Mr. Whitmore. That sentence settled heavily over the pastry line. Annie saw Richard absorb it. For a man used to solving problems with signatures, it was a hard thing to hear, that some people could not afford to tell the truth until the truth was already burning them. Victor used the pause. This is turning into a pity hearing. I run a high-end kitchen, not a charity hall. If every employee with a sad story gets to challenge authority, you won't have a restaurant. You'll have chaos. Annie flinched at sad story. It was how people like Victor dismissed a whole life without having to look at it. Richard's eyes sharpened. You keep mistaking dignity for disorder. Victor stared at him. Richard continued. A kitchen needs leadership. It does not need theft covered by titles. Victor's voice lowered. Be careful, Mr. Whitmore. I have a reputation outside this building. So do I, Richard said. Mine is attached to the name on the door. Claire's tablet chimed. She looked down. The morning footage from the first week, the cake appeared as ready. Richard nodded. Put it up. The wall monitor changed again. The clip opened before sunrise. Annie entered the pastry kitchen with her canvas bag over one shoulder. The timestamp read 5:04 a.m. She washed her hands, tied her apron, and took out her notebook. She worked alone, quietly, setting up oranges, butter, flour, and a small jar. She moved with less confidence than she had during the test, but the method was the same. Roast peel, weight, honey, thyme, vanilla, salt, notes. Annie watched herself on the screen and felt exposed in a new way. She looked tired, poorer than she wanted to look, smaller than she felt inside. She wished the camera had captured the years behind the motion, not just the lonely minutes. The clip jumped forward. Victor arrived, tasted the syrup, looked toward the empty corridor, then took a photo of Annie's notebook page with his phone. A sound went through the kitchen. Victor spoke at once. For documentation. Claire looked at him. Then why isn't the photo attached to the company file? He had no answer. The clip continued. Annie returned, noticed the notebook had moved, and looked around in confusion. Victor said something. There was no audio, but his gesture toward the sink was clear. Annie lowered her head and went back to work. Richard looked at her. What did he say there? Annie's throat tightened. He said I shouldn't stand around like I owned the place. Marcus looked away, jaw tight. Richard's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. And you still made the cake? Annie nodded. It still had to be ready for service. The simplicity of that answer seemed to strike several people at once. She had been insulted and had kept working. Not because she was weak, but because that was what survival often required. Claire turned off the monitor. There's more. Enough to establish repeated preparation by Annie before Chef Langley's arrival. Richard looked at Victor. I asked you once if you created the cake. I'm asking again. Victor's face hardened. I elevated it. That isn't the question. I made it suitable for Whitmore. That isn't the question. Victor's control cracked. Fine. She made a base. I gave it value. Annie felt the words hit her chest. Richard did not move. No, the customers gave it value when they came back for it. She gave it value when she created it. You gave it your name. Victor's mouth opened, then closed. Richard reached for the envelope on the table and held it up. This was never yours. For a moment, Annie thought he might hand it to her then. Instead, he laid it beside her notebook, close enough that the meaning was clear but not rushed. This review continues, he said. But the bonus is withdrawn from Chef Langley effective now. Victor's face went pale. You can't do that. I just did. Claire made a note. Richard turned to the staff. Anyone scheduled under Chef Langley will report to Miss Bennett for the rest of the day. No one discusses this with guests. No one touches recipe files without Claire's approval. Is that understood? A scattered chorus answered. Yes, sir. Annie had never heard the kitchen answer as one before. It should have made her feel safe. It did not. Not fully. Victor was still standing there, angry and wounded in his pride. Men like him did not become harmless just because they had been caught. Richard seemed to know it too. He looked at Victor. You will wait in the private dining office until I call for you. Victor straightened. Am I being escorted? Richard's voice stayed low. Don't make that necessary. Victor looked at Annie one last time. The hate in his eyes was quiet now. More dangerous because it had nowhere to go. Then he turned and walked toward the side hall, his shoes striking the tile harder than needed. When he disappeared, Annie finally let out a breath she had been holding too long. Marcus stepped beside her. You did good. Annie shook her head. It's not over. No, Marcus said, but he's not holding the knife anymore. Richard heard that and turned back from the office doorway. No, he said. Now I am, and I intend to use it carefully. Annie looked at him, unsure whether to feel grateful or afraid. Maybe both were honest. Her notebook lay open on the table, the envelope beside it, the empty syrup jar catching a little of the kitchen light. Her name had not yet been restored. Her future had not yet been promised. But the lie had lost its clean coat, and for the first time all morning, Victor Langley was the one waiting outside the room where decisions were made. Claire waited until Victor's footsteps faded down the side hall before she returned to the table. She gathered the printed logs, Annie's notebook, and the copied screenshots into 3 neat stacks. Richard stood with one hand on the back of a chair, his eyes on the closed corridor door, as if he expected Victor to come back with another excuse. Annie stayed where she was. Without Victor in the kitchen, the space should have felt easier to breathe in. It did not. The ovens were still warm, the staff still watched from the edges, and the money envelope still lay beside her notebook like a thing too large to touch. Richard turned to Claire. "Where are we on the formal side?" Claire glanced at her tablet. Enough to justify immediate suspension, enough to withdraw the bonus, enough to open a company investigation into prior recipe claims. Termination will depend on HR review, but given the footage and his admission, it is strong. Marcus let out a quiet breath through his nose. Strong is one word for it. Richard looked at him. "You think I'm moving too slowly?" Marcus did not back away from the question. "I think people at the bottom get fired in 5 minutes for being 5 minutes late. People at the top get a process." Several cooks looked down, but Annie saw the truth of it move through them. Richard took the criticism without flinching. "You're not wrong." That answer surprised Marcus. It surprised Annie too. Richard continued, "But I want this done so cleanly he cannot walk out of here and turn himself into the victim." Claire nodded. "That is the right call." Annie understood, but the word cleanly hurt. Nothing about this felt clean. Her recipe had been taken. Her voice had been brushed aside. Her mother's notebook had been passed across a work table like evidence in a case she never wanted to bring. Richard turned to her. "Miss Carter." "Sit down." She shook her head quickly. "I'm fine, sir." "You don't look fine." The words were not unkind, but they made her feel smaller. Annie pressed her hands into her apron. "I'd rather stand." Richard nodded once and did not push. That helped. Claire stepped closer. "Annie, I need your permission to scan the relevant notebook pages. We'll mark them confidential and return the original to you immediately." Annie looked at the notebook. "Will everyone see it?" "No," Claire said. "Only legal, HR, and Mr. Whitmore for now." Richard added, "And no one copies anything beyond what proves the recipe timeline. Your personal notes stay private." Annie searched his face for carelessness and found none. She still hesitated. "There are things in there that aren't recipes." "I understand," Claire said. Annie nodded. Claire carried the notebook to the office scanner. Annie watched until it disappeared through the doorway, feeling as if part of her had been taken into that small office too. Marcus came near with a cup of water. "Drink." Annie took it with both hands. "Thank you." He kept his voice low. "You held yourself better than most grown folks would have. I almost cried the whole time." "Crying doesn't mean you didn't stand." Annie looked at the water. She wanted to believe that. In the kitchens she had known, tears were used against people. If you cried, you were weak. If you did not cry, you were cold. Either way, someone found a reason to dismiss you. Richard moved to the far end of the table. "I need to ask you something, and I want a direct answer." Annie straightened. "Yes, sir. Did you ever sign anything giving Chef Langley rights to use your recipe under his name?" "No, sir." "Did anyone explain recipe ownership rules when you were hired?" "No. I signed the intern paperwork. Nobody explained much. They told me where to change, where to clock in, and not to be late." Richard looked toward Claire. She wrote that down. Annie added quickly, afraid it sounded like blame, "I was grateful for the chance." Richard's mouth tightened. Gratitude should not be used as a leash. The sentence made Annie look up. He did not soften it. "Remember that." Before she could answer, the kitchen phone on the wall rang. Everyone turned toward it. A line cook picked it up, listened, then covered the receiver. "Miss Bennett, front of house wants to know if pastry is delayed for lunch service." Claire came back from the office doorway. "Tell them limited dessert menu for lunch. No honey velvet until further notice." Victor's cake name hit Annie like a bad taste. Richard heard it too. "Take his name off it now." Claire paused. "We can remove the item from the POS temporarily." "No," Richard said. "I want the name removed from every internal menu, training sheet, and prep label. Until legal finishes, listed as honey citrus cake, pending attribution. Annie looked at him. Pending attribution. It was not her name yet, but it was no longer Victor's. The difference made her grip the cup harder. Marcus murmured, "That's a start." Richard looked at him. "It is only a start." Claire returned with the notebook and handed it to Annie first, not Richard. "Here." I scanned only the pages connected to the cake. Annie accepted it like something fragile. "Thank you," Claire said. "I also checked the photo metadata from the footage. Chef Langley photographed your notebook page 2 days before the cake appeared on the specials menu." Richard's expression did not change, but his voice dropped. "Good." The corridor door opened before anyone could say more. Victor stood there, though he had been told to wait. His coat was still on, but the authority it once carried seemed strained around him. A young security manager stood behind him, uncertain whether to intervene. Victor held up his phone. "I need my personal knives from my station." Richard did not move. "Security can collect them." Victor's eyes moved to the table, to the envelope, to Annie's notebook in her arms. "This has gone far enough." Claire stepped forward. "Chef Langley, you were instructed to wait in the private dining office." "I am not a criminal." "No one said you were," Richard said, "but you are under review." Victor's face twisted. Because she cried? Because she waved around a family notebook and told a sad little story? Annie felt the words strike her, but she did not step back. Marcus moved half a step closer. Richard's voice became colder. "Be careful." Victor ignored the warning. "No, let's say what everyone is afraid to say. This is a luxury restaurant. It is not a neighborhood bake sale. Guests expect a certain standard, a certain face behind the food. She may have made something charming at home, but I made it acceptable here." A hard silence followed, not empty but charged. Even the security manager stopped shifting. Annie's eyes burned again. She hated that he could still find new ways to make her feel poor in front of everyone. Richard stepped toward Victor. "Acceptable to whom?" Victor blinked. Richard continued. "To critics? To wealthy guests? To you?" Victor's mouth opened, but no answer came fast enough. Richard pointed toward the plates. "The cake was already acceptable. The sales proved that. The guests proved that. What you did was decide the person who made it was not acceptable." Victor's cheeks darkened. "That is not what I said." "It is exactly what you said." Annie could barely breathe. Victor looked at her with open contempt now. "You think this world will clap because your name is on a menu? You think they'll pay $50 for a slice created by an intern from South Atlanta?" The words cut through the kitchen. Annie's fingers tightened around the notebook. Her voice came out quiet, but it did not break. "They already paid for it." Victor froze. She went on, still quiet. "They paid for it when they thought it was yours, so maybe the cake was never the problem." Marcus's eyes shone with pride. Claire looked down at her tablet, but Annie saw the corner of her mouth move. Richard looked at Annie for a long second, then turned back to Victor. "You will leave the kitchen now." Victor's laugh was sharp. "Are you firing me?" "I am suspending you pending termination review." Victor stared at him. "You'll regret this." "I regret not asking more questions sooner," Richard said. "Not this." Security stepped forward. Victor looked once more at Annie. There was no mask left. "You won't last a month." Annie's throat tightened, but this time she answered. "Maybe," she said, "but the cake will." Victor's face hardened. Security guided him toward the corridor. His footsteps faded again, this time with someone beside him. No one spoke until the door shut. Richard turned to Claire. "Prepare the suspension letter. Lock his system access. Preserve all files." Claire nodded. "Done." Then Richard looked at Annie. The envelope remained on the table between them. "Miss Carter," he said, "you are not going back to intern duties today." Annie's heart jumped. For one terrible second, she thought he meant she was done too. Richard saw the fear cross her face. "That is not a dismissal." She swallowed. "Then what is it, sir?" "It means you're going to sit with Claire and document your recipe properly, in your name." The words came slowly to Annie, as if her mind did not trust them enough to let them in all at once. "My name?" "Yes," Richard said. "Your name." She looked down at the notebook in her arms. Her mother's old cover was worn, the corners bent. The pages held together by care more than strength. Annie pressed it close. For the first time since Richard had come down to the kitchen, no one spoke over her, and that quiet felt different from silence. It felt like space. Claire led Annie into the small office beside the pastry line, and for a moment Annie felt as if she were stepping into another kind of kitchen. The room was cramped, full of filing boxes, clipboards, old vendor catalogs, and a computer that took too long to wake up. Through the glass panel in the door, she could still see the pastry staff moving carefully around the prep tables, trying to keep service alive without touching the thing everyone wanted to discuss. Annie sat only after Claire pulled out a chair and said, "Please." Even then, she perched on the edge, her notebook resting in both hands. Claire opened a blank recipe form on the computer. "We'll start with the formal name." Annie looked up. "Formal name? The recipe needs a title for the internal record." Annie's mouth went dry. She had written names in her notebook before, crossed them out, tried others, laughed at some of them alone in her apartment, but naming it here, inside the company system, felt different. "Honey citrus velvet cake," she said. Claire typed it, then paused. "Creator?" Annie's hands tightened around the notebook. Claire looked at her. "I'm going to type Annie Carter unless you tell me otherwise." Annie nodded, but her throat closed before she could speak. Claire entered it. The sound of the keys was small, ordinary, almost nothing, yet Annie felt it in her chest. Her name had entered the system, not as a clock-in, not as an intern assigned to prep. As creator, Richard stood near the office door, not inside enough to crowd her, not outside enough to seem removed. He watched the screen, then looked at Annie. "Is Carter spelled C-A-R-T-E-R? "Yes, sir." He nodded. "Good," Claire continued. "We need the source description. This can be brief. Something like, original recipe developed independently prior to employment." Annie hesitated. "Can we say it was developed from my mother's kitchen notes?" Claire looked at Richard. Richard answered before Claire could. "Yes," Claire typed carefully. "Original recipe developed by Annie Carter from family kitchen notes and independent testing prior to employment at Whitmore Reserve, Atlanta." Annie stared at the sentence. It was not poetry. It did not say how many nights she had sat on the floor waiting for a cake to cool because she was too tired to stand. It did not say how often she had wished her mother were there to taste the next version. But it told the truth in a language the company could not ignore. Claire turned the notebook toward her. "Walk me through the formula. Not the whole memory. Just the working version." Annie almost smiled at that. Not the whole memory. As if the memory could be separated from the work. Still, she opened to the page and began. "Cake flour, 280 grams. Sugar, 240. Butter, 170. Softened but not greasy. 3 eggs. Buttermilk, 180 milliliters. Baking powder. Fine salt. Zest from 2 oranges, but the peel for the syrup is separate." Claire typed. Richard listened. At first, Annie spoke carefully, afraid of sounding foolish. Then the steps began to pull her forward. She explained the syrup, the cooling point, the time removal, the salt timing, the way part of it had to go into the batter and part into the glaze. Claire asked practical questions. Shelf life, yield, allergen notes, plating. Annie answered what she knew and admitted what she did not. When she said, "I don't know yet," she braced for Victor's voice in her head, ready to call her untrained. Richard only said, "Then we test it." Annie looked at him. He continued, "Not knowing something is not the problem. Pretending you know is." Claire kept typing. For the next 20 minutes, the office filled with the sound of keys, the printer warming, and Annie's low voice explaining the cake she had protected for years. Outside, lunch service began. Plates moved. Orders called. The restaurant above them kept going, unaware that a young woman's future was being pulled out from under a lie and placed, piece by piece, into writing. Claire finally leaned back. "That's enough for the first record. Legal will refine the ownership language." Annie stiffened at the word legal. Richard noticed. "This is to protect you." "Yes, sir. You don't sound convinced." Annie looked down at her notebook. "I've never seen paperwork protect someone like me before." Claire stopped typing. Richard took that in without answering too fast. "Then let it start today." Before Annie could respond, there was a knock on the glass. Dana stood outside, holding a small stack of printed order tickets and looking nervous. Claire opened the door. "Sorry," Dana said. "I didn't want to interrupt, but the front is asking what to tell guests about the cake. People are ordering it." Claire glanced at Richard. "We pulled it temporarily." Dana nodded, then looked at Annie. "One table asked for the orange honey cake by name, said they came back for it." Annie's face warmed with something close to pain. Richard asked, "How many requests?" Dana checked the tickets. 7 since lunch started. Richard turned to Annie. "Can you make a small service batch under Claire's supervision?" Annie's eyes widened. "Now? If you're able," Claire added. "Only if you want to. We can keep it off menu for the day." Annie looked through the glass at the kitchen. Victor was gone, but his presence still clung to the walls. The staff moved around the stations with careful energy, as if waiting to see what shape the day would take. Annie felt tired enough to sit on the floor, but the guests had come back for the cake. Her cake. If it vanished today, even for good reasons, Victor's shadow still touched it. "I can make it," she said. Richard studied her. "You're sure?" "Yes, sir." They returned to the pastry line. The staff quieted, not completely, but enough for Annie to feel every step. She placed her notebook on the shelf above her station, away from splatter, then took out fresh oranges. Claire stood nearby with the recipe record open on her tablet. Marcus moved to the side, ready to help if allowed, but not interfering. Richard said, "This batch is Annie's. She leads." Claire documents. "Marcus may assist only if Annie asks." The words made Annie freeze for half a second. She leads. No one had ever said that about her in a professional kitchen. Victor's absence left a space, and Richard had placed her in it. Annie washed her hands. The motion steadied her. Water over skin, towel, apron, breath. She set out the ingredients, weighing each one. This time, nobody laughed when she waited for the orange peel to cool. Nobody mocked her when she smelled the syrup. Dana passed behind her and whispered, "You need anything?" Annie shook her head, then changed her mind. "Can you bring me 2 more sheet pans and parchment?" "Sure." It was such a simple exchange, yet it nearly broke her. Asked. Answered. No insult attached. Marcus came near with the butter. "Soft enough?" Annie checked it. "A few more minutes." He nodded. "You call it." Across the line, Evan watched with open curiosity. "Why do you split the syrup?" Annie glanced at Richard, unsure whether she should answer while working. Richard said, "Teach." So Annie did. She explained that flavor should not hit all at once. It should arrive in layers, like a good memory. First scent, then crumb, then finish. Evan nodded as if he had just learned something he could use. The batter came together cleanly. Annie folded with steady strokes, not fast, not showy. Claire logged each step. The first pans went into the oven. Annie marked the time. As they baked, Richard's phone buzzed again. He checked the screen but did not leave. Annie noticed and tried not to. Claire noticed too. "Your board is calling." "They can wait." Annie looked up before she could stop herself. Richard gave her a brief glance. "I walked away too quickly once today." The words were not an apology, not yet, but they were close enough to make Annie lower her eyes. At 28 minutes, she checked the cakes. One needed more time. One was ready. Marcus said nothing, but his face told her she had called it right. Soon the kitchen filled with the scent that had started all of this. Orange warmed into honey, butter held soft by buttermilk, thyme barely there. The first service slices went out under a temporary ticket label. Honey citrus cake. Annie Carter formula pending. Annie read the label twice. Pending was still not enough, but it was no longer stolen. 10 minutes later, Dana came back from the dining room. Table 12 wants to send compliments to the chef. Annie instinctively looked around for Victor. Dana smiled gently. Not him. The words settled over Annie so suddenly that she had to grip the counter. Marcus turned away, pretending to check the cooling rack, but his shoulders lifted with quiet laughter. Richard looked at Claire. Record guest response. Claire typed, "Already doing it." Annie pressed her palms flat on the table, trying to keep herself grounded. The cake was going out. Guests were eating it. Her name was not printed yet, but inside the kitchen, on the ticket, in the recipe record, the truth had begun to attach itself. where it should have been all along. Then the office phone rang. Claire answered it, listened, and her expression changed. Richard saw it. What? Claire covered the receiver. Security says Chef Langley is refusing to leave the building. He's in the private dining office asking to speak with you. He says if this goes on record, he'll call every critic he knows before dinner. The warmth Annie had felt drained quickly. Marcus muttered, "There it is." Richard's face settled into calm again, but not the careless kind. This calm had weight. He looked at Annie. "Keep working." Annie nodded, though her hands tightened. Richard turned toward the corridor. "Claire, with me. Marcus, stay with Miss Carter." Claire set the tablet down beside Annie's station before following him. "The record is saved." Richard stopped at the doorway and looked back once. "Annie," he said. She turned. "Do not let his noise make you doubt your work." Then he left to face Victor. Annie stood in the heat of the ovens with Marcus beside her, and a second batch waiting to be glazed. For the first time, she understood that proving the truth was only one part of justice. Keeping it safe after it was proven might be the harder part. The second batch came out cleaner than the first. Annie knew it before she touched the pan. The scent had settled the right way. Not sharp, not heavy, with the orange softened by honey and the butter carrying it all like a low note. She set the pan on the rack and kept her hands there for a moment, letting the heat press through the mitts. Marcus stood beside her, not too close. "You called that one right." Annie gave a small nod. She wanted to feel proud, but her attention kept drifting to the corridor where Richard and Claire had gone. Victor was no longer in the kitchen, yet his anger still reached them through walls. It was strange how a man could leave a room and still make people move carefully. Dana returned from the dining room with 2 empty plates. They finished every bite. Annie looked at the plates before she could stop herself. Only a trace of glaze remained on one, a crumb on the other. Dana set them by the sink. One lady asked if the chef would share the story behind it. Marcus looked at Annie. "There's your first problem. Now folks want a story." Annie almost smiled. "I don't know what story to tell." "The true one," Marcus said. She shook her head. "People don't always like the true one." "No, but they remember it." Before Annie could answer, raised voices came from the hallway. Not loud enough to make out every word, but enough to turn heads. Richard's voice remained low. Victor's did not. Evan, the young cook near the mixer, leaned slightly toward the hall. "He's really going at it." Marcus gave him a look. "Work." Evan straightened. "Yes, sir." Annie reached for the powdered sugar and began the glaze. Her hands needed a task. She sifted carefully, added a spoon of syrup, then a small pour of cream. Stirring kept her from imagining Victor in that office, turning himself into the victim, making her sound like a liar who had tricked everyone with tears and a notebook. The hallway door opened. Claire came back first, face controlled, tablet against her chest. Richard followed. Victor was not with them. Annie froze with the whisk in her hand. Richard looked across the kitchen. "Chef Langley has been escorted from the building." No one cheered. It was not that kind of moment. A few people exhaled. Someone near the dish station whispered, "Lord." Dana closed her eyes for half a second. Annie did not move. Richard continued, "His system access has been suspended. His office is sealed until legal finishes review. If he contacts any staff member about this matter, forward it to Miss Bennett and do not respond." Marcus asked, "And if he contacts people outside?" "He already threatened to," Richard said. "That is being handled." Claire stepped to Annie's station. "He claims he refined your work into a marketable product. He also claims all creative work made on company time belongs to the company." Annie felt the whisk slip in her hand. Richard said, "That does not give him the right to put his name on it. But can the company still take it?" Annie asked before fear could stop her. The question came out small, almost ashamed. She hated asking it, hated showing how little protection she expected from any system with paperwork and lawyers. Richard did not answer quickly. "The company has rights to menu items developed here. But your notebook predates your employment. And the core recipe came from you before you ever walked into this building. We will put that in writing." Claire added, "You'll have legal counsel, not company counsel only. Independent counsel. Paid by Whitmore. Chosen from a list you approve." Annie stared at her. "I don't understand." Marcus did. His face shifted. They're saying you get a lawyer who doesn't work for them. Richard nodded. Yes. Annie looked from Marcus to Richard. Why? Richard's mouth tightened. Because you should have had someone protecting your interests before today. Since you didn't, we start now. The answer was plain, and that made it harder to distrust. Still, Annie did not know what to do with it. She had woken before dawn worried about bus fare and whether Victor would criticize her piping. Now people were talking about legal counsel as if her recipe were worth defending. Claire looked at the glaze in Annie's bowl. May I? Annie nodded and handed over a clean spoon. Claire tasted a dot from the edge. This is the same finish as the guest slice. Annie relaxed a little. It needs 5 minutes before glazing. Richard looked toward the dining room entrance. How many more orders? Dana checked the tickets. 9 pending. More if we put it back on. Richard turned to Claire. Put it back on for dinner under the temporary name. No Langley. No signature claim. Add a note. Limited availability. Claire typed. Done. Annie said, Sir? Richard looked at her. If it goes out tonight, who makes it? You do, if you're willing. Marcus assists. Claire documents. Annie glanced at Marcus. Marcus lifted both hands. I can follow orders when they're good ones. For the first time that day, a few people laughed softly. The sound did not erase what had happened, but it broke the pressure around Annie's chest. She nodded. I'll make it. Richard watched her a moment. You don't have to prove it again. I know, Annie said, though she was not sure she did. But if people came back for it, I want it right. Marcus murmured, That's a chef talking. Annie looked down quickly, embarrassed. The next hour moved fast, not frantic like Victor's kitchen, but focused. Annie scaled ingredients, while Marcus prepped pans. Dana brought fresh oranges. Evan asked before touching anything. Claire documented the process, taking photos of each stage and labeling files with Annie's name. Richard stepped aside to take calls, but he did not leave the kitchen. That mattered more than Annie wanted to admit. At one point, while Annie waited for the peel to cool, Richard came to the counter. Miss Carter. Yes, sir? What would you need to produce this consistently across the group? She blinked. Across the group? If it is going to other locations, it needs a training process. Her pulse quickened. The syrup can be batched, but not rushed. The peel has to be roasted fresh, or it tastes flat. Stores can prep syrup a day ahead, maybe 2. But the glaze should be finished same day. And they can't use extract. Richard almost smiled. Almost. You said that like you've been waiting to say it. I have, Annie admitted. Write it down. I will. No, he said. Write it into the official procedure, with Claire. Annie nodded, her throat tight again. Marcus placed a tray of cooled cakes beside her. Glaze is ready when you are. Annie poured slowly, letting the glaze settle over each cake in a thin coat, not hiding the crumb, just finishing it. This was the part Victor always overdid. Too much shine, too much decoration, too much trying to prove luxury. Annie kept it simple. Candied peel, a narrow line of syrup, a small thyme flower if service had them, nothing more. Claire photographed the first finished plate. Richard looked at it. That is what I tasted in the report. Annie glanced up. The report had taste? No, he said. But it had repeat orders. In this business, that is close. Dinner prep began around them. The whole kitchen had to return to motion. Pans moved. Tickets printed. Sauces warmed. Servers called questions through the pass. Yet the energy had changed. People still worked hard, but they no longer moved under Victor's shadow. They looked at one another more. They asked instead of snapped. It would not fix years in a day, but Annie could feel the first loosened knot. Near the end of the rush, Claire came back with a printed sheet. She placed it in front of Annie. What's this? Annie asked. Temporary recipe record, Claire said. Creator line included. You'll review it before final filing. Annie read it. Honey citrus velvet cake. Creator. Annie Carter. Her name looked almost unfamiliar in print. Not because it was wrong, but because no one had ever placed it beside something valuable before. She touched the edge of the paper but did not pick it up. Marcus stood beside her. Go on. It won't bite. Annie gave a shaky laugh and lifted the page. Richard's phone buzzed again. He read the message. then looked toward Claire. Board moved to tomorrow morning. Claire raised her eyebrows. You postponed it? I did. Annie looked at him. Because of this? Richard met her eyes. Because I should have handled this before any meeting upstairs. She did not know what to say. A server appeared at the pass. Table 18 wants to know if they can send compliments to Annie. The name reached her before the sentence finished. Not Chef, not Langley, Annie. Her hands tightened around the paper. Dana grinned from the line. You want to go out there? Annie shook her head at once. No. No. Ma'am, Marcus chuckled. Let the cake speak tonight. Richard nodded. There will be time for the room to know your face. Tonight, we make sure the record knows your name. Annie looked down at the printed sheet again. The letters did not move. They stayed there, black ink on white paper, plain and firm. For most of the day, she had been afraid the truth would vanish if she stopped holding it. Now, for the first time, someone else had written it down. The dinner rush eased after 9. But the kitchen did not return to normal. It could not. Too much had been said, printed, tasted, and recorded. The usual noise remained, pans rinsed at the sink, ticket printers clicking, servers asking for last desserts, but beneath it ran a new caution, as if everyone knew they had crossed a line and could not pretend the old one was still there. Annie stood at her station with the temporary recipe record folded once beside her notebook. She had read it so many times that the words had begun to blur. Honey Citrus Velvet Cake. Creator, Annie Carter. It was not the final contract. It was not a menu launch. It was not protection from every person who might still doubt her. But it was paper with her name on it, and in Annie's life, paper had usually been used to warn, deny, charge, or dismiss. This one did something else. Claire came back from the office with a fresh stack of documents. We need one more statement from you before we close the review for tonight. Annie's shoulders tightened. Did I forget something? No. This is your account in your own words. Timeline. What you created before hiring. What happened after you started. What Chef Langley said to you. It doesn't have to sound formal. I'll clean up the format, but the words should be yours. Annie looked toward Richard. He was near the pass, speaking quietly to the general manager. He had loosened his tie, but he still looked like a man built out of decisions. Do I have to do it now? She asked. Claire's voice stayed gentle. Sooner is better. Before anyone tries to confuse the timeline. Annie nodded. That made sense. It also felt cruel that the truth had to be captured quickly before a lie learned how to dress itself. Marcus wiped down the cooling rack beside her. I'll finish your station. Annie shook her head. You don't have to. I know I don't. That was all he said, and somehow it made accepting easier. Claire led Annie back into the small office. This time, the chair did not feel like a trap. Only uncomfortable. Annie sat with her notebook in front of her, and the printed creator record beside it. Claire placed a recorder on the desk, then paused. Only with your permission. Annie looked at the small device. Will Victor hear this? No. Will Mr. Whitmore? Yes. And legal, if needed. Annie swallowed. Okay. Claire pressed record. State your name, please. Annie Carter. And your position? Annie hesitated. The word intern sat on her tongue like something too small now, but it was still true. Pastry intern at Whitmore Reserve, Atlanta. Claire nodded. Start wherever you need to. Annie stared at the edge of the desk. I made the first version of the cake before I worked here. I didn't make it for Whitmore. I made it at home. When I started here, I brought my notebook because I was afraid of losing it. Chef Langley tasted the cake after I made a staff batch. He said it had potential and asked for my notes. I thought he was helping me. Her voice wavered on helping. She stopped, embarrassed. Claire said, Take your time. Annie breathed in. A few days later, I saw it on the menu under his name. I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe that was how it worked. Maybe because I was an intern, he had to put his name first. But then people started congratulating him, and he never said mine. He told me to keep making the syrup early. He told me not to talk about test batches. He said I should be grateful to be learning. She looked at Claire, ashamed though she had done nothing wrong. I believed part of that. Claire did not interrupt. Annie went on. Today, when Mr. Whitmore gave him the money, I knew if I stayed quiet, it would be gone. Not just the bonus. The whole thing. My recipe, my notebook, what my mother taught me, it would all become his story. Her voice cracked, but she finished. That's why I spoke. Claire stopped the recorder. That was clear. Annie wiped her cheek quickly. I'm sorry. For what? For crying again. Claire leaned back. Annie, I've watched grown executives cry over bad quarterly reports. You're allowed a few tears over 3 stolen years. Annie let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but not quite. A knock came at the door. Richard stood outside the glass with his phone in his hand. Claire opened it. Sorry to interrupt, he said. We have a complication. Annie's stomach dropped. What happened? Richard looked at Claire first. Langley sent an email to 3 senior managers before his access was fully locked. He claims Annie admitted to bringing an outside recipe into company operations without approval, and that he was trying to protect the restaurant from liability. Annie felt the blood leave her face. I didn't say that. I know, Richard said. Claire's jaw tightened. Did he attach anything? A partial screenshot of her text about bringing the syrup. Claire closed her eyes for a second. Out of context. Very. Annie gripped the arms of the chair. The old fear returned fast. Familiar. Almost humiliating. It did not matter how much proof they had gathered. One man with the right tone could still make her sound guilty in an email. Richard saw it. Look at me, Miss Carter. She did. This is why we document before we celebrate. He is not winning. He is reacting. Annie nodded, though her throat still felt tight. Claire picked up her tablet. I'll send the full evidence packet to those managers now. Footage, logs, notebook scans, live test notes, and Annie's statement. Richard said, add my note. Make it clear no one is to discuss this outside legal and executive review. Claire typed, done in 5 minutes. Richard looked back at Annie. He may try to make you feel as if telling the truth caused a mess. It didn't. The mess was already here. You just stopped sweeping around it. Annie held those words carefully. She wanted to believe them. She was not fully there yet. From the kitchen, Dana appeared at the office doorway. Sorry. Table 18 is still asking if Annie can come out. They're celebrating an anniversary. They said the cake reminded them of something they used to get on road trips in Georgia. Annie shook her head at once. I can't. Richard did not push. Then don't. Dana nodded. I'll tell them the kitchen appreciates it. She turned to leave, but Annie stopped her. Wait. Dana looked back. Annie stood slowly. Her knees felt weak. Can I write something instead? Dana smiled. Sure. Claire handed Annie a blank comment card from the desk. Annie thought for a moment, then wrote, Thank you for tasting the cake with such kindness. I hope it brought back a good memory. Annie. She handed it to Dana, embarrassed by how simple it sounded. Dana read it and softened. They'll love this. When Dana left, Richard looked at the card in her hand until it disappeared into the dining room. That is what Victor never understood, he said. Annie turned. What, sir? Richard gestured toward the kitchen. He thought luxury meant distance. You understand memory. That's why the cake works. Annie did not know what to do with praise from him. It felt too large, too sudden. She looked down at her notebook. My mother used to say food should make people feel less alone. Marcus, passing the doorway with a tray, heard her and stopped. Your mother was right. Richard's phone buzzed again. He checked it, then looked at Claire. The managers received Langley's email. 2 are asking whether to pause the dessert rollout. Claire's face cooled. Of course they are. Annie's chest tightened. Will they? Richard slipped the phone into his pocket. No. He said it so firmly that even Claire looked at him. Richard continued. Tonight's service numbers, guest responses, documentation, all of it goes to the board tomorrow. Not as Langley's dessert. Not as an unnamed cake. As Annie Carter's recipe under review for company-wide launch. Annie's lips parted. Company-wide? Pending legal structure, Claire said quickly. But there was warmth behind it. But yes, that is the direction. Annie sat back down because standing suddenly felt difficult. Richard stepped into the office. There is one more thing. The temporary bonus remains withdrawn from Langley. It will not be reassigned until legal clears the payment. Annie nodded. She had almost forgotten the money in the rush of everything else. But, Richard said, you will be paid for every hour worked on development and production since the cake entered service. Retroactively. Claire will calculate it. Annie looked up. I was on intern pay. I know. Her voice came out small. That's a lot of hours. Yes, Richard said. It is. Annie pressed her hands together in her lap. For a second, she imagined rent paid early, groceries without counting every dollar, maybe a better pair of kitchen shoes. The thought made her ashamed and relieved at the same time. Claire's tablet chimed. She read the screen. The couple at table 18 wrote back on the comment card. Dana must have entered it into the guest notes. Claire read aloud. Tell Annie we haven't tasted something that honest in years. Annie covered her mouth. No one spoke for a moment. This time, no one rushed to fill it. Richard looked toward the kitchen, where the last slices were being plated under Annie's temporary record. Finish your statement, he said. Then go home. Annie nodded. Yes, sir. And Miss Carter? She looked up. Tomorrow, we do this in daylight. She understood what he meant. Not hidden in the kitchen, not whispered between stations. In front of the people who needed to hear it. Annie looked at her notebook, at the record, at Claire's tablet, at Marcus waiting just outside the door. For the first time all day, the thought of tomorrow did not feel like a threat. It felt like a door she might be able to walk through without begging someone to open it. Annie finished her statement a little after 10. Claire saved the file, printed a copy, and turned the page toward her for review. The words looked stiff on paper, but they were hers. She read each line slowly, afraid of missing some hidden phrase that could be used against her later. When she reached the end, Claire handed her a pen. Only sign if it's accurate, Claire said. Not because anyone is standing here. Annie looked at Richard. He had stepped outside the office to take another call, giving her space without making a speech about it. Marcus waited near the pastry line, arms folded, watching the last of the staff break down stations for the night. It's accurate, Annie said. She signed her name. The pen felt heavier than it should have. Annie Carter. The same name printed on school forms, rent notices, bus passes, and now on a statement that might decide whether her work survived under her own name. Claire took the signed page and slid it into a folder. I'll scan this tonight. You'll receive a copy. Annie nodded. Thank you. Claire studied her for a second. Do you have a ride home? Annie looked down. I take the bus. At this hour? It's fine. It's not fine, Claire said, not sharply, but with the tone of someone making a decision. We'll have a car take you. Annie's first instinct was to refuse. Favors had weight. She had learned that early. People gave things, then reminded you later what you owed them. Richard came back in before she could answer. A company car. No charge, no obligation. Just a ride home after a long day. Annie hesitated. Marcus called from the doorway. Take the ride, girl. Pride doesn't keep anybody safe at a bus stop after 10. Annie gave him a tired look. You always talk like that? When folks need hearing. For the first time in hours, Annie almost smiled. Okay, thank you. Richard looked at Claire. Have the driver use the side entrance. No press. No guests. Claire nodded. Annie gathered her notebook, the temporary recipe record, and the nearly empty syrup jar. She wrapped the notebook in the dish towel again and placed it in her canvas bag. Before closing the bag, she checked the back pocket where the photograph of her mother was tucked between two recipe pages. Still there. Richard noticed but did not ask. Annie appreciated that. As they walked back into the kitchen, the staff had thinned. Dana was wiping down the counter near the pass. Evan stacked clean mixing bowls. The dishwasher sprayed sheet pans with steady bursts of water. The air smelled of soap, butter, citrus, and fatigue. Dana came over holding a small white pastry box. I packed 2 slices. One for you, one for whoever you want to share it with. Annie looked at the box. I don't need. Dana raised an eyebrow. Don't argue. I labeled it right. Annie turned the box slightly. On the side, in black marker, Dana had written, Annie Carter's honey citrus velvet cake. Annie blinked fast. Dana's voice softened. Just temporary marker. But it looked good. It does, Annie said, barely above a whisper. Evan came closer, rubbing the back of his neck. Annie, I'm sorry. She looked at him, unsure what he meant. For not saying anything sooner, he said. I saw some of it, not all. Enough. Annie held the pastry box with both hands. You were scared too. He nodded. Still should have said something. Marcus stepped in before the apology became too heavy. Then say something next time before a girl has to put her whole heart on a prep table. Evan nodded again. I will. Richard listened from a few feet away. Annie wondered if men like him understood how rare that small promise was. Not a policy. Not a memo. A coworker admitting he had looked away. Claire's phone chimed. She read the message and came toward Richard. The driver is ready. Also, HR confirmed Victor's suspension notice has been delivered electronically. Security has his badge. Richard nodded. Good. Annie tightened her grip on her bag. Leaving felt strange. For most of the day, she had fought to stay in that kitchen long enough to be heard. Now that she could leave, her legs did not seem to trust the floor. Richard turned to her. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Not for kitchen duty. For a meeting with me, Claire, HR, and legal. Marcus may attend if you want someone with you. Annie looked at Marcus. He shrugged. I'm old. I sit well. Yes, Annie said quickly. Please. Richard nodded. Then Marcus attends. Annie swallowed. Am I still supposed to clock in for my regular shift? No, Claire said. You'll be paid for the day as development time. Development time. Annie had heard chefs use words like that about important people with clipboards, not about girls who took buses and carried notebooks wrapped in dish towels. Richard reached for the temporary record on the counter and handed it to her. Keep a copy tonight. Annie accepted it. What if Chef Langley tells people I lied? He will, Richard said. The honesty startled her. He continued. People who depend on a lie rarely give it up politely. That's why tomorrow matters. Annie looked at the paper in her hand. What happens tomorrow? We put the evidence in front of the people who can no longer pretend not to know. Then we decide the launch, your contract, compensation, and public credit. Public credit made her stomach tighten. Public? Claire said. Only with your consent. But if the cake moves forward, your name should not stay hidden inside an internal file. Annie thought of guests reading her name on a menu. She thought of strangers deciding whether someone like her could make something worth ordering in a room like Whitmore Reserve. She thought of Victor's words, "You won't last a month." I'm scared of that, she admitted. Richard's answer came without delay. That is reasonable. She expected him to tell her not to be scared. He did not. Marcus picked up his coat from a hook near the door. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's showing up with your knees knocking and doing the right thing anyway. Dana smiled. You sound like my grandfather. Your grandfather was probably right about things. This time Annie did smile. Small but real. At the side entrance, the night air hit cool against her face. Atlanta traffic hummed beyond the alley, and the restaurant's service lights washed the pavement in pale yellow. A black company car waited near the curb. Annie had never ridden in one like it. She suddenly became aware of her flower-marked shoes, her wrinkled apron folded over her arm, the cheap canvas bag against her side. Richard walked only as far as the doorway. He did not make the driver open the car door for her like a performance. He simply said, "Get some rest, Miss Carter." Annie looked back at him. "Mr. Whitmore? Yes? Why did you stop?" He seemed to understand she meant the moment at the door, the 3 minutes, the thin space between being dismissed and being heard. He took a breath. "Because you sounded like someone who had nothing left to lose except the truth." Annie looked down. That was closer than he knew. "I almost didn't," he added. She looked up again. His face remained serious. "That is on me." Annie did not know how to answer an apology that had not yet fully become one. So she nodded. "Good night, sir." "Good night, Annie." He used her first name carefully, not like Victor had used it to scold her, but as if it belonged in the sentence. Annie got into the car with the pastry box on her lap and her notebook held close. As the driver pulled away, she looked back once at the side entrance of Whitmore Reserve, Atlanta. The door closed behind Richard, and the building returned to its expensive calm. But Annie knew better now. Inside that kitchen, something had shifted. Not enough to fix the world. Not enough to erase what had happened, but enough that tomorrow, when she walked back in, she would not be coming only as the intern Victor tried to send home. She would be coming with her name already written down. The next morning, Annie arrived at Whitmore Reserve, Atlanta 20 minutes early and still felt late. The company car had offered to pick her up, but she had taken the bus instead. It was not pride exactly. She needed the ordinary ride, the hard plastic seat, the woman beside her carrying grocery bags, the driver calling out stops, the city moving, as if yesterday had not changed anything. She needed to remember that the world outside the restaurant did not know her name yet, and maybe that was all right. She carried her canvas bag against her side, and the pastry box Dana had given her the night before, now empty except for a few crumbs. She had eaten one slice alone at her small kitchen table after midnight. The second she had left wrapped on the counter because she could not bring herself to finish it. It felt strange to eat the thing that had almost been taken from her. At the employee entrance, the security guard looked up from his desk. It was the same man who usually waved people through without much interest. Today, he sat straighter. "Morning, Annie." She stopped for half a second. "Morning." He checked the log. "Miss Bennett said you're expected upstairs in conference room B." Upstairs. Not the pastry line. Not the dish corridor. Conference room B. Annie's hand tightened on the strap of her bag. "Do I need a visitor badge?" He shook his head. "Your badge works." That small answer steadied her more than he knew. Her badge still worked. Marcus was waiting near the service elevator in a brown jacket and clean shirt, looking uncomfortable outside his kitchen clothes. He held a paper cup of coffee in one hand and another in the other. "Figured you'd come early," he said. Annie took the cup. "Thank you. Don't thank me. It's bad coffee." She smelled it and almost smiled. "It is. Good. Means your nose is still working." They rode the elevator up together. Annie watched the floor numbers rise and tried not to think about Victor. She had slept badly, waking several times with the feeling that she needed to defend herself again. Each time she reached for her notebook on the chair beside her bed, touched the cover, then lay back down. Marcus noticed her gripping the cup. "You don't have to talk more than you need to. What if they ask something and I forget? Then say you need a minute. What if they think I'm not professional?" Marcus looked at her. "Professional doesn't mean letting folks rush you into mistakes." The elevator doors opened onto a floor Annie had only seen from the service side. The carpet softened her steps. Framed photographs of Whitmore restaurants lined the walls, each one showing perfect dining rooms and smiling chefs. Annie wondered how many names were missing from those pictures. Claire met them outside conference room B. "Good. You're here." She looked at Annie's face and lowered her voice. "You okay?" Annie wanted to say yes. Instead, she said, "I'm here." Claire accepted that. That's enough. Inside the room, Richard sat at the head of a long table with two legal advisors, an HR director named Paula Grant, and a silver-haired man, Annie, recognized from company videos as Thomas Keene, chief financial officer. A folder rested at each seat. At the far end, there was an empty chair for her, and one beside it for Marcus. Annie hated the empty chair. It made her feel expected and judged before she sat down. Richard stood when she entered. The others followed a second later, some more naturally than others. "Good morning, Miss Carter," Richard said. "Good morning, sir." He gestured to the chair. "Please sit." She did. Marcus sat beside her, not too close, but close enough. Paula Grant opened the meeting with a careful tone. "Annie, this is a formal review, but it is not a disciplinary meeting for you. You are here to confirm facts, ask questions, and discuss next steps. If you need a break, say so." Annie nodded. "Yes, ma'am." One of the legal advisors, a woman named Denise Alden, leaned forward. "We've reviewed the initial materials, the notebook scans, video footage, shift logs, recipe history, and text messages all support your claim that the core recipe was developed by you before the dessert was submitted under Chef Langley's name." Annie heard the words but did not relax. Support your claim was not the same as believe you, though it was close enough for now. Thomas Keene adjusted his glasses. "The sales lift is significant. Dessert revenue at the Atlanta location increased 32% over 3 weeks. Repeat table notes mention the cake by description, even before the name was promoted. Richard looked at Annie. That is why I came downstairs yesterday. Annie nodded. Thomas continued. From a business standpoint, the item has rollout potential. From a legal standpoint, attribution and compensation must be structured before that happens. Compensation. Rollout. Attribution. The words circled Annie like things too large for her small table at home. Denise turned a page. Annie, did anyone at Whitmore ask you, before yesterday, to assign ownership of this recipe to the company? No, Mom. Did Chef Langley ever tell you the cake would be submitted under his name? No. Did you give him permission to photograph or use your notebook? Annie's mouth went dry. No. Denise nodded and wrote something down. Paula looked at Annie with a softer expression. Did you feel pressured not to speak about the recipe? Annie looked at Marcus, then at her hands. Yes. By Chef Langley? Yes. In what way? Annie took a breath. He told me not to talk about test batches. He said people would think I was bragging. He said I should be grateful to learn. When I tried to ask about credit, he said I didn't understand how kitchens worked. Thomas looked uncomfortable. Did you report that to anyone? Annie's face warmed. No, sir. Why not? Richard's eyes shifted toward Thomas, but he did not interrupt. Annie answered quietly. Because I needed the job more than I trusted the process. No one spoke for a moment. Marcus leaned back slightly, as if to say, let that sit. Richard finally said, that answer belongs in the final report. Claire typed it into her notes. Thomas cleared his throat. Understood. Denise closed the first folder and opened another. Mr. Whitmore has authorized several immediate actions. First, Chef Langley remains suspended pending termination. Second, his recipe submissions for the past 2 years will be audited. Third, the honey citrus velvet cake will not be sold under his name again. Annie's hands loosened a little in her lap. Paula added, fourth, your internship status will change, if you accept. The proposed role is junior pastry developer, Atlanta test kitchen, with pay adjusted accordingly. This includes benefits eligibility. Annie looked up quickly. Developer? Claire gave her a small smile. That is the work you were already doing. Thomas slid a document across the table. There is also a retroactive development payment for the period when the cake was being produced and sold without proper credit. Annie looked at the number on the page. For a second, she could not read it. Then she did, and the room tilted slightly. Marcus leaned close. Breathe. Annie did. Is this real? Richard answered. Yes. Annie stared at the number again. It was not billionaire money. It was not movie money, but it was more than enough to pay rent, repair the oven at home, buy good shoes, replace the phone with the cracked screen, and still put some away. To Annie, it looked like air. She blinked hard. I don't know what to say. Denise spoke gently. You don't have to accept or sign anything today. In fact, we recommend you review it with independent counsel. Whitmore will cover that cost. Annie looked at Richard. You still mean that? Yes. Even if the lawyer tells me not to sign. Richard did not hesitate. Then you should listen to your lawyer. That answer did more to earn her trust than any promise could have. Paula turned another page. There is one more matter. Public attribution. Annie's stomach tightened. Claire said, the company can list the cake as Annie Carter's honey citrus velvet cake. We can include a short menu line. Created by Annie Carter. Inspired by family kitchen notes from South Atlanta. But only if you approve that wording. Annie looked at the paper. Her name in a company file had felt large. Her name on a menu felt like stepping into a dining room full of people she had never met and letting them decide if she deserved to be there. What if people don't like that? She asked. Thomas said carefully. Some guests may not care who created it. Marcus gave him a look. That wasn't what she asked. Thomas stopped. Richard answered instead. Some people may not like it. Some may say things they'd never say at a table if they had to look you in the eye. That is true. Annie appreciated the honesty, even though it scared her. Richard continued. But the company will not hide your name to make those people comfortable. Annie looked down at the proposed menu line. Created by Annie Carter. Inspired by family kitchen notes from South Atlanta. Her mother would have laughed first, probably from disbelief. Then she would have cried. Then she would have told Annie to stand up straight because a blessing should not find you bent over. Annie touched the page. Can it say inspired by my mother's kitchen instead? Claire looked at Richard. Richard nodded. Yes. Claire edited the line. Created by Annie Carter. Inspired by her mother's kitchen in South Atlanta. Annie read it once, then again. Yes, she said. That's right. The room seemed to shift with that answer. Not dramatically, not like a celebration, but like a record being corrected. Richard reached for the cash envelope from the day before. It had been placed inside a clear evidence sleeve, counted, labeled, and set beside his folder. This was given to the wrong person, he said. Legal advises we process your payments properly, not as loose cash. But I wanted you to see it withdrawn from him formally. He slid the sealed envelope toward Claire, who marked it voided bonus, Victor Langley. Then Richard placed a new document in front of Annie. Your payment will be issued under your name, not handed across a kitchen like a favor. Annie nodded slowly. Thank you. Richard held her gaze. This is not charity. She remembered him saying something like that the night before. This time, she understood it better. It is correction, he said. Annie's eyes burned again, but she did not apologize for it. Paula closed her folder. We'll pause here. Annie, take the documents home. Review with counsel. For today, you may leave after meeting the attorney list, or you may go downstairs if you choose. No kitchen duty is required. Annie looked at Marcus. What do you think? Marcus rubbed his chin. I think going home is wise. I also think sometimes a person needs to walk through the place that tried to shrink her and let it see she's still standing. Annie knew which one she needed. I want to go downstairs, she said. Richard stood. Then I'll walk with you. Annie looked startled. You don't have to, sir. I know. They left the conference room together. Richard first, Claire beside him, Annie and Marcus behind. In the elevator, no one spoke. Annie held the folder against her chest. The pages inside were heavy, but not like a burden, more like proof. When the doors opened onto the kitchen level, the familiar heat and noise met her. The pastry staff looked up one by one. Dana stopped wiping a counter. Evan lowered a tray. The general manager stood near the pass, uncertain what expression to wear. Richard did not make a speech. Not yet. He only stepped aside so Annie could enter before him. That small gesture did what a speech might not have done. Annie walked into the pastry kitchen with her folder in her arms and Marcus at her side. Her station was clean. Her notebook shelf had been cleared. A fresh label sat on the temporary recipe bin. Honey citrus cake. Annie Carter formula. Dana smiled at her. Evan nodded. Marcus gave her a quiet, "Go on." Annie placed her folder on the table, touched the label once, and let herself breathe. Yesterday, she had begged not to be sent away. Today, no one asked why she was there. Richard did not address the staff right away. He let Annie reach her station first. That mattered. If he spoke before she moved, the moment would belong to him. By waiting, he allowed the kitchen to understand that the person at the center of this was not the owner, not the company, not the scandal, but the young woman standing beside the prep table with a folder held against her chest. Annie set the folder down carefully. Her fingers rested on the label taped to the ingredient bin. Honey citrus cake. Annie Carter formula. The words were temporary, Claire had said. Pending legal, pending final menu, pending review. But Annie had lived long enough to know that some temporary things were stronger than promises if they were written at the right time by the right hand. Dana came closer first. You okay? Annie looked at her and nodded. I think so. That's better than yesterday. A little. Evan stood near the mixer, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Do you need help setting up? Annie almost said no automatically. Then she stopped. If she was going to lead the cake, she had to learn how to accept help without giving away ownership. Yes, she said. Can you zest the oranges, but keep the peel strips separate? No white pith. Evan nodded quickly. Got it. Marcus made a soft sound of approval behind her. Listen to that. giving orders and everything. Annie looked down, embarrassed. I'm asking. Good leaders do. Richard heard the exchange but did not interrupt. He waited until Claire entered with the updated record on her tablet, and Paula from HR stepped in behind her. Only then did he move to the center of the pastry line. Everyone, he said. The kitchen slowed, not stopped, because lunch prep still had to happen, but slowed enough to listen. Richard's voice was even. Yesterday, a recipe created by Annie Carter was confirmed to have been submitted and sold under Chef Langley's name. That was wrong. It happened under this company's roof, under my leadership, and it will be corrected under my leadership. Annie felt every word land near her, not on her. She was grateful for that. He was not using her as decoration for his apology. He was naming what happened. Richard continued. Chef Langley is suspended pending termination review. His prior submissions will be audited. Any staff member with information about past work being miscredited will speak to Miss Sesson, Bennett, or HR. No retaliation will be tolerated. Paula added, that includes schedule changes, station changes, reduced hours, hostile treatment, or pressure to stay quiet. Dana crossed her arms. Wish that had been said years ago. Richard looked at her. So do I. No defense. No corporate fog. Just the answer. Annie saw several people take that in. Claire stepped forward. Effective today, the cake will be recorded internally as Honey Citrus Velvet Cake, created by Annie Carter. The final menu language is under review with Annie's approval. During that process, all production must follow Annie's documented method. Annie will lead the training for this item with Marcus Reed assisting. Evan's eyebrows rose. Dana smiled. Annie's stomach turned. Lead training. The phrase sounded impossible. Yesterday she had been fighting to finish a sentence. Now the same kitchen was being told to learn from her. Richard looked toward Annie. Do you want to say anything? She wished he had warned her. Her mouth went dry at once. Marcus leaned slightly toward her. Only if you want. Annie wiped her hands on her apron, though they were clean. She looked at the staff, at faces she knew from early mornings and hurried service, faces that had seen her nearly sent away. Some looked kind. Some looked guilty. Some looked uncertain. That was real enough. I don't have a speech, she said. A faint breath of laughter passed through the line. Gentle this time, not cruel. Annie continued. I just want the cake made right. It isn't hard because it's fancy. It's hard because you have to be patient with it. You can't rush the syrup. You can't cover bad flavor with glaze. And you can't pretend the last step is the only step that matters. She stopped, realizing the sentence meant more than cake. The kitchen understood it too. Marcus nodded once. That'll preach. Annie looked at him despite herself, and a small smile broke through. Claire turned her tablet toward Annie. We need to prep a training batch. I've scheduled a small group. Evan, Dana, 2 pastry assistants from dinner, and Marcus. Annie looked at Richard. Now, if you're ready, he said. If not, tomorrow. Annie touched the label on the bin again. Her fear had not disappeared. It had changed shape. Yesterday it told her to be quiet. Today it told her people would watch for every mistake, but fear was no longer the only voice in her. Now, she said, the training began awkwardly. Annie stood at the main prep table while the others gathered around. For a moment, she did not know where to put her hands. Victor used to stand at that table like it was a stage. Annie did not want a stage. She wanted them to understand the cake. She placed oranges, honey, thyme, vanilla bean, and salt in front of her. The syrup is the first thing, she said. If this is wrong, the cake won't come back later. Evan raised a hand halfway, then seemed to feel silly. Do we have to raise hands? Dana said. Lord, Evan. Annie laughed softly. No, just ask. He nodded. How dark do you roast the peel? Not dark, Annie said. Warm. You're not trying to brown it. You're trying to wake it up. She placed peel strips in the pan and let them heat. Smell now. They leaned closer. At first it's sharp, she said. Like when you first cut into an orange. Wait until that sharp edge calms down. If it smells sweet before honey, you went too far. Dana closed her eyes briefly. I get it. Annie looked at her. You do? Yeah. It turns round. Annie smiled. Exactly. Claire typed that into the note field. Turns round? Annie looked embarrassed. Maybe don't write that, Claire said. Actually, that may help training. Marcus chuckled. Some things the tongue knows before the manual does. Richard stood near the back, watching without taking over. Once, his phone buzzed. He silenced it. Annie added honey after the peel cooled. Then time. This is where people leave it too long. Time gets bossy. Evan laughed. Bossy time, got it. The kitchen felt different with laughter that did not cut. When the batter stage came, Annie let Evan cream the butter and sugar while she watched. He started the mixer too high. Lower, she said. He corrected it. Why? Dana asked. If you beat too much air into it, the cake rises fast and dries near the edge. It should lift steady. Marcus looked at Evan. Like people. Evan groaned. Mr. Reed, you turning every step into life advice? When the step fits, Annie shook her head, but she was smiling. Then she caught Richard watching her. Not judging. Listening. The smile faded into something quieter. By late afternoon, the training batch came out right. Not perfect. Annie could taste a slight heaviness in the crumb, and she said so. No one argued. No one told her she was being difficult. Claire recorded the adjustment. Reduce mixing time by 30 seconds for larger batch. Dana tasted a small piece. Still better than half the stuff we call premium. Annie looked at her. It can be better. Richard stepped forward then. That sentence is why the rollout will wait until Annie signs off on the training standard. Annie turned. Sir, I don't know if I'm ready to sign off on other locations. You will be given time. And if I say something isn't ready, then it isn't ready. She searched his face. Even if it costs money? Richard's mouth tightened. Yesterday taught me what rushing for numbers can cost. That answer stayed with her. Near the end of the day, Claire brought a proof from the design team. It was not final. Only a printed draft of the new dessert menu. Annie took it with both hands. There, beneath the dessert section, in clean black type, was the line, Annie Carter's Honey Citrus Velvet Cake, created by Annie Carter, inspired by her mother's kitchen in South Atlanta. Annie read it once, then again. The kitchen sounds faded behind the pounding in her ears. Marcus came to her side but did not touch the page. There it is. Dana leaned over and whispered. Looks good in print. Annie tried to answer, but the words would not come. She thought of her mother's notebook, the bus ride, Victor's hand pushing her aside, Richard almost leaving, the 3 minutes that had almost not been given. She thought of all the people who had cooked, cleaned, carried, created, and still disappeared behind someone else's name. Richard stood across from her. Is the wording right? Annie ran her thumb just below the sentence, careful not to smudge the ink. Yes, she said. That's right. Claire smiled. Then we'll hold for legal review and your counsel. Annie nodded, still looking at the paper. The menu was not a fairy tale ending. It would not protect her from every whisper, every doubter, every person who thought a girl like her should be grateful for scraps. But it was a beginning written clearly enough that no one in that kitchen could pretend not to see it. When Annie finally placed the proof beside her notebook, the 2 pages seemed to speak to each other, one from the kitchen that raised her, one from the kitchen that had tried to erase her and failed. For the first time, they carried the same name. The legal review took 3 weeks. To Annie, it felt longer. She kept working through it. Not as an intern sent wherever hands were needed, but as the person responsible for the cake that now carried her name in every draft, every training sheet, every controlled test batch. She met the independent attorney Richard had promised. She asked questions slowly, sometimes twice, and no one in the room made her feel foolish for needing plain answers. She signed nothing until she understood it. Marcus told her that was the first lesson of adulthood most people learned too late. Victor Langley did not return. His termination became official in the 2nd week, after the audit found more files with thin notes, missing contributors, and names that had never reached a menu. Annie heard about it from Claire, not as gossip, but as fact. He's contesting parts of it, Claire said one afternoon, setting a folder beside Annie's station. Annie was trimming orange peel. Will he win? No. The answer was short enough to steady her. What about the others? Annie asked. The company is contacting them. Some will receive back pay. Some may be offered credit where possible. It won't fix everything. Annie placed the peel into a small bowl. But it fixes something. Claire nodded. Yes, it fixes something. The official launch came on a Thursday evening. Not at a gala, not under chandeliers, not with speeches that made everyone uncomfortable. Richard insisted the first public serving under Annie's name happen at Whitmore Reserve, Atlanta, in the same building where the recipe had nearly been taken from her. The dessert menu was reprinted on thick cream paper. Servers were trained to describe the cake simply, without turning Annie into a sob story for wealthy guests. Created by Annie Carter, inspired by her mother's kitchen in South Atlanta. That was enough. Annie arrived before dawn that day. She told herself it was because the syrup needed time, but Marcus saw through her the moment he walked in. You couldn't sleep. No, sir. Good means you care. I think I care too much. No such thing if you learn where to set it down. He hung his coat and came to the station. What do you need? Annie looked at the oranges, honey, thyme, vanilla, butter, flour, buttermilk, sugar. Nothing expensive enough to impress Victor. Everything necessary. Start the ovens, please. Left deck still runs hot. Marcus smiled. Yes, chef. Annie looked up fast. He kept his face serious for half a second, then let the smile come through. You better get used to hearing it. I'm not a chef. Not yet by title. But don't let titles be the only thing that tells you what you are. We've seen where that leads. By late afternoon, the cakes rested in clean rows, glazed and finished with candied peel. Annie checked each one, not for perfection in the cold sense, but for honesty. No extract, no rushed syrup, no heavy glaze hiding a weak crumb. The first dinner tickets came in at 6 to 10. Honey citrus velvet cake, then another, then 4 more. Dana returned from the dining room after the first plates went out. Table 6 read the menu line out loud. Annie pretended to adjust a tray. Is that bad? No. The woman said. Good for Annie. Then ordered 2. Marcus laughed from the sink. That woman has sense. Annie tried to smile, but her hands were damp. It was easier when the cake was anonymous in the dining room. Now each order felt like someone calling her name from the other side of the wall. Richard came down around 7, wearing a dark suit and no expression Annie could read. Claire walked beside him with a tablet, as usual. He did not interrupt service. He stood near the pass and watched as Dana carried 2 plates out. How is it going? He asked. Claire checked the numbers. First hour, 28 orders, no complaints. 4 written compliments already. Richard looked at Annie. And from the kitchen? Annie wiped her hands on a towel. The syrup batch held. The larger pan needed 2 extra minutes. I noted it. Good. She waited for more, but he did not turn the moment into a ceremony. He had learned, perhaps, that not every important thing needed his voice over it. At 8:15, a server named Leah came in holding a guest card. Annie? Annie turned. Yes? This is from table 12. They asked if I could give it to you. Annie took the card with both hands. The handwriting was careful. The kind older people often had. Shaped by years before phones replaced letters. My wife and I have been married 41 years. This cake reminded her of the orange cake her mother made when we were young and broke and happy. Thank you for bringing that memory back to our table. Annie read it twice. Her throat closed. Dana leaned near. You okay? Annie nodded, though her eyes told the truth. Yes, I just need a second. She stepped into the small office and pressed the card flat on the desk. She thought of her mother's notebook, of the final line printed on the menu, of all the years she had believed her little kitchen was too small to matter to people in rooms like this. Yet here was a man who had been married 41 years, sitting at a white tablecloth, remembering being young and broke because of something she made. Richard appeared at the doorway but did not come in. Claire said, you received a guest note. Annie nodded. Good one. She handed it to him. He read it, then gave it back. That is the business I forgot we were in. Annie looked at him. Dessert? Memory, he said. Hospitality, not performance. She folded the card carefully. My mother would have liked that. Richard leaned one shoulder lightly against the doorframe. I owe you something more direct than I've said. Annie grew still. He continued. I was ready to leave that day. Not because I knew you were wrong, Because I thought you were small enough to ignore. Annie looked down at the guest card. That was wrong, he said, and I'm sorry. The apology was plain. No audience, no polished statement, no company language. That made it harder to hide from. Annie's voice was quiet. Thank you for saying it. I should have listened sooner. Yes, sir, she said, then worried she had been too honest. Richard accepted it. Yes, I should have. From the kitchen, Marcus called. Annie. Glaze check. She stepped past Richard. Coming. The night went on. Orders rose, then slowed, then rose again when a few guests asked for slices to take home. By closing time, the last cake had been cut. The final count was higher than Claire had projected. Richard reviewed the number, gave one nod, and said, We roll out in phases, only after Annie approves training. Claire smiled. Already noted. Marcus removed his apron and hung it on the hook. That's how it starts. Next thing, she'll be flying around teaching folks not to burn orange peel. Annie shook her head. Please don't say flying. Dana laughed. Too late. Corporate chef Annie. No. Junior pastry developer Annie. Claire corrected, amused. Annie looked at the menu proof lying near her notebook. For now, the kitchen emptied slowly. Dana left first, then Evan, then the dish team. Marcus stayed until Annie finished wiping her station. You need a ride? He asked. I'm taking the car tonight, she said. Look at you. Learning. She smiled. Good night, Mr. Reed. Good night, Annie. And write this day down. After he left, Annie opened her mother's notebook. She turned past the old recipes, past the failed versions, past the page where she had written Mom would have liked this one. On a clean line beneath the final formula, she wrote slowly, the day they finally listened. She let the ink dry before closing the book. Richard and Claire had already gone upstairs. The dining room lights were dim, the ovens were off. The kitchen, for once, did not feel like a place waiting to judge her. It felt like work, and work she could return to without shrinking. Annie placed the notebook in her bag, then looked once more at the printed dessert menu resting on the counter. Annie Carter's Honey Citrus Velvet Cake, created by Annie Carter, inspired by her mother's kitchen in South Atlanta. She touched her name lightly, not because she feared it would disappear, but because she wanted to feel the truth of it under her fingers. Not every kind of justice begins in a courtroom. Sometimes it begins beside a hot oven, with a tired girl holding a small jar and asking not for pity, not for praise, but for one honest chance to be heard. Sometimes it smells like orange peel, honey, butter, and patience. Sometimes it is not loud at all. Sometimes justice is simply this: the right name, finally written where everyone can see it. The lesson of Annie's story is that talent can live in the quietest corner of the room, and truth should never be judged by a person's title, age, skin color, or position. Annie did not ask for pity. She only asked to be heard. Her courage reminds us that stealing someone's work is not just taking an idea, but taking their dignity, their years of effort, and their name. Real justice begins when people in power stop walking away, listen to the overlooked, and give credit where it has always belonged. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.